So I'd like to welcome everyone. This is our second session today of the Rent Guidelines Board. We have invited tenant group testimony from a series of speakers. This is following up on our morning session where we had invited testimony from a series of owner group testimony. So I'm going to turn it over to Oksana Mironova.
Great, thank you so much. Is it possible for me to share my screen to show some slides?
You should be able to. You have that option available?
Let me see.
Oksana, would be under the picture you're seeing, center. It would have a green share your screen button. Yeah, good.
Great. Are you all seeing a chart?
It's not up yet. It looks like it's going to come up.
Okay, so
Wait,
I have
Oksana, can't come up. It kind of looked like it was loading and then it just stopped.
I have an older computer that doesn't play well with Zoom, so I'm just going to read my testimony, and hopefully you all could take a look at the charts.
Oksana, could you email the testimony to Andrew right now, and then maybe he can share the screen while you're going through your testimony?
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna begin my testimony now, and yeah, hopefully you could take a look at the figures in the testimony itself a little bit later. My name is Oksana Mironova, and I'm a housing policy analyst with the Community Service Society of New York. CSS is an independent nonprofit organization that addresses some of the most urgent problems facing low-income communities in New York City, including the effects of the city's chronic housing crisis. Thank you for the opportunity to present our comments on the potential impact of the 2020 rent guidelines. The decisions of the Rent Guidelines Board are among the most important factors influencing the well-being of low-income New Yorkers. About 365,000 low-income households live in rent-regulated apartments, twice the number in public and subsidized housing combined. Every year since 2002, CSS, in partnership with Lake Research Partners, which is a top opinion public firm, has conducted a survey called the Unheard Third. We use the survey to track the evolving hardships of New York City's low-income residents and their views on what programs and policies would help them get ahead. Our data has consistently shown that many low-income regulated renters are on the edge of housing instability and would have a great difficulty bearing any major economic shock. Our Unheard Third polling has shown that almost half of low-income rent-regulated households, that's about 175,000 households, consistently reported being unable to afford a $25 increase in rent. That is a 1.8% increase on the average stabilized rent of $1,400. Since 2017, some low-income renters likely fell back on their rent and eventually lost their homes, while others had to make more and more difficult trade-offs between rent, food, medical care, transit fares, and other necessities. From the 2019 Unheard Third survey, we know that 55% of low-income rent-regulated respondents had difficulty affording basic expenses. About 1 in 3 had difficulty affording a Metro card or had to skip meals to save money. A simple reason for these high rates of hardship is that incomes have not kept up with rising rents. The median rent-to-income ratio for low-income regulated households bypassed the severe rent burden threshold, increasing from 40% in 2002 to 52% in 2017. The dual culprits for the rapid rise of regulated rents over the past 2 decades were high RGB guidelines during the Bloomberg administration and the impact of rent law loopholes, most of them now abolished with the new rent laws. which allowed landlords to raise rents well above the annual guidelines. While tenants' real wages have stagnated over the past few decades, landlord incomes have continued to grow. Even though the NOI declined slightly since last year, it has grown significantly over a longer time frame, increasing by 48.7% above inflation since 1990. Given the high cost of housing, it is unsurprising that many renters have been unable to save money. The vast majority of low-income regulated renters, that's 71%, have less than $1,000 in savings for an emergency, like an unexpected loss of income or hospitalization. There are also major disparities in savings by race and Latinx origin among regulated renters across all incomes. 60% of Latinx regulated renters and 59% of Black regulated renters reported having less than $1,000 in savings. That's compared to 42% of Asian renters and 35% of white renters. This is in line with national research, which points to a broadening racial wealth gap across all socioeconomic levels. COVID-19 is a major economic shock impacting low-income renters and renters of color in particular. According to a survey conducted by the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, as of April 19th, earners in 37% of all New York households lost their job. Latinx households and Asian households and low-income households were particularly hard hit. So that's 44%, 40%, and 42% respectively, higher than the overall number. While we're unable to disaggregate those job losses by housing type, analysis of 2018 census data shows that low-income renter households were much more likely to include at least one person working in an industry currently at loss for job loss. So that's non-essential retail, daycare, and personal care services, compared to moderate and high-income renters. So 42% of low-income renters include a person in a non-essential job. Similarly, Latinx and Asian renter households were the most likely to have at least one person working in an at-risk job in 2018. In addition to renters, there was also that were already housing insecure. COVID-19 has pushed hundreds of thousands of others closer to insolvency. The city has 716,000 low and moderate income renter households who are in the labor force and do not receive federal housing assistance like Section 8 vouchers. Our research has shown that more than 160,000 of those renter households who rent in the private market have minimal savings and have lost much of all of their income as of mid-April. Expanded unemployment insurance will help some, but will leave out important segments of the New York City workforce, specifically undocumented workers. The stimulus check will offer some reprieve as well, but similarly, it excludes undocumented workers and it's a one-time payment. In the short term, delays in unemployment insurance claims have been a huge problem because many renters lack the savings to get by even for a few weeks. The RGB cannot address systemic issues like wage stagnation or federal disinvestment in the affordable housing sector, but addressing tenant hardships in rent-stabilized apartments is within the board's purview. And RGB action in the past has led to material benefits for low-income renters. I hope you have a chance to look at my testimony later on, and I have a figure that shows the share of low-income regulated renters reporting housing-related hardships, which include falling behind on rents, utility shutoffs, and eviction rates from 2014 to 2019. And there's an observable dip in housing hardships during the 2 years when the RGB instituted rent freezes in 2016 and 2017. It is important to note that the two rent freezes did not lead to increased building distress or abandonment. RGB's research shows very low shares of distressed buildings from 2016 to 2018. The last figure available for 2018 was 5.4%. RGB rent freezes have eased housing hardships for rent-regulated tenants in the past and can do so again during what will be an extremely trying and long pandemic recovery period. We call on the RGB to freeze tenants' rents for both 1 and 2 year leases to help mitigate the immediate impacts of the pandemic, and also to provide some sense of long-term stability during an incredibly turbulent and uncertain time. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana.
Sorry, Oksana, if I could I share my screen? Because it seems like you have a lot of important figures and graphs, and I want to make sure that we look at them.
Sure.
Andrew, is there any way that anyone can show their screen so that we can actually have the figures up that she was talking about?
I can do it. I will do it.
In the interim, Alex, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say I'm really, really sorry about the passing of Tom Waters. That was a huge loss. I think the last time I saw him was at a rent guidelines meeting here, hearing. So I'm sure I'm not alone in the shock of his passing. But my question is, you mentioned briefly undocumented residents and they're not being eligible for unemployment benefit, expanded unemployment benefits and so on. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on to what extent these residents are in rent stabilized housing and what work you've done on this topic, if any.
Thank you. And thank you so much for acknowledging Tom. I really, really appreciate that, and CSS in general does as well. We unfortunately, or fortunately, in a lot of ways, there's not that much hard data on the number of rent stabilized tenants who are either undocumented or who live in mixed status households, where there might be a couple of people who are documented and a couple of people who are not. The only thing that we know is that the housing vacancy survey, because it focuses on the unit as opposed to the individual, includes within its sample undocumented people. So within the 365,000 low-income households who are rent stabilized renters, there's likely a portion of those is very likely undocumented, but there's not that much hard data that I could talk about.
Thank you.
Oksana, just kind of following up on that, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this one if the data's out there yet, but if we were to say like there's 100 New Yorkers before the pandemic and X% were employed and X% were on unemployment and X% were on fixed incomes, and now with the pandemic, do we have a sense of like, people who are employed but are not on unemployment for a variety of reasons? Do we have any way of quantifying kind of how income has changed from work and non-work sources since the pandemic has started?
I don't have a good number off the top of my head. I could take a look at that and see if I could figure that out from using the housing vacancy survey and some of the public data that's been becoming available through the public health, the CUNY Public Health School. But we do know that the rent stabilized tenants who are receiving Section 8, they're in the immediate term. So I'm talking the next couple of months, not necessarily looking forward. Their rents, their subsidy will continue to be covered through the CARES Act. But we also know that 37% of all renters reported having at least one person who lost their job, and a greater number of people among low-income households and Asian and Latinx households as well. And those numbers are, I think, within 40% or so. So it's a lot of people. It's a really huge chunk of rent stabilized tenants.
Thank you.
Oksana, I don't know if you wanted to highlight any of the slides that you had shared with us.
Yeah, thank you, Shayla. Could you, you're the one who's sharing the screen right now, right?
That's me, it's Andrew. Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. Would you be able to go to the last slide?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is, this slide shows uses our unheard third data survey, which is a survey we do every single year. And it's a scientific survey, it's randomly sampled, so it's statistically valid. It shows something that we called housing hardships, and we've been tracking it basically every single year since 2002. The top line is the number of low-income regulated tenants who have fell behind on rent. The Gray line is the number of rent regulated tenants who had their utilities shut off because they weren't able to pay to keep them on. The yellow line is the number of tenants who were threatened with eviction. So not necessarily evicted, but fell behind on rent and either got a notice or were taken to housing court. And the dotted line is RGB guidelines for 1 year, the historic RGB guidelines. And what you see is in 2016 and 2017, there is a noticeable dip. The survey, our margin of error is about 3%, so I wouldn't necessarily pay too close attention to the fact that there's little fluctuation year to year, but there is that noticeable dip over the 2-year period makes me fairly confident in the fact that RGB guidelines have an impact on the way that low-income people experience housing instability.
Oksana, just on that, I mean, so are you saying, are you hypothesizing that it's a causation or just a correlation? I mean, what's your hypothesis as to why that small change, you know, between a 0 and a 1% would have such a big impact?
So it's a correlation. I can't from the way that our survey is structured, it's not longitudinal, so I can't imply causation, but there's an evidence of strong correlation.
And what is your, you know, so if we had implemented a 1% increase versus a rent freeze, I mean, what's the correlation that you're seeing, that the size of the increase or just the absolute rent freeze? What's the correlation?
I think it's an absolute rent freeze, not necessarily a one, kind of like a 0 versus 1 versus 2%.
Okay.
Oksana, I've had the privilege to sit on other panels with you where you've talked about the rent laws more explicitly. Can you share with us your thoughts? You know, we this morning heard a lot about how, you know, rent increases are now practically, you know, not going to happen if RGB doesn't vote for a rent increase because of all of the mechanisms are now no longer available for a lot of land owners across the city because of the rent laws of, you know, of June of 2019. And I wonder, what is your experience? What are you drawing from that? I've heard you speak a few times on it, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah. So
Just one second, Oksana. I'm going to cut out the share screen so people can see the people that are speaking. So, but if you want me to go back to it, please just let me know.
sure. Great. So the historic change in the rent laws that happened in 2019, it will have a huge impact. It would have had a huge impact on the way that the housing market in the city functions, whether or not COVID-19 happened, but COVID-19 happened, so we're here. And it did do away with many of the loopholes that landlords use to hike up rents beyond the RGB increases. So the vacancy bonus being the main one. Landlords are still able to increase rents because of major capital improvements. There is the provision, the IAI, individual apartment improvement provision is also still in the books, even though it's capped and much lower. So the potential is still there, and the potential to recoup costs because of improvements to the building are still very much there.
Oksana, hi, this is Patty. Thank you for your testimony today. Oksana, you can't be, I'm surprised, is your opinion that that owners could increase IAIs and increase the rents as high as they used to be? Because the cap has basically destroyed individual apartment improvements for owners, and the lack of a vacancy increase and the lack of longevity means that owners really can't increase rents that much.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. The cap has been lowered significantly. Major capital improvements, I think that's an open question, and we will see what happens over the next couple of years. Many have argued that the system was so deeply flawed that we should have gotten rid of them altogether. But the potentiality of recouping costs is still very much there.
Well, not for tenants in occupancy though, because tenants in occupancy would have to consent to have individual apartment improvements.
Right, but that was the case before the changes went into effect as well. And from what I understand, the majority of tenants didn't consent to IAIs under the older regime as well.
Yeah, but having a cap of $89 is hardly much of an increase for an owner to renovate an apartment.
Well, I mean, I think the numbers that Oksana mentioned earlier is that, you know, 1/3 of, and you can correct me, Oksana, if I listen to all the numbers correctly, but you mentioned the numbers of tenants who are a $25 increase would be impactful for them. And so I think that the rent laws were responding to the extreme need and the crisis we have in the city. And I think that, you know, the elected officials were intending to lower those caps because they saw the need for rent stabilized units. And I think that that's, I think that, you know, the numbers are bearing exactly what I think folks were intending to do. I think that many tenants, a $25 increase would be devastating. There are tenants that are $100, it would be devastating. But I think that the point is that folks are basically one paycheck away from being homeless and not having their apartments. And the decision that we make here is super impactful, not only because of the data, but because we have heard time and time again in hearing that the impact to day is really real for folks. And I think that's a pretty, to me, that's a compelling argument to have the conversations we're having around what do rent adjustments look like, and should we be having a rent freeze in a year like this year when we know the economy will bear out in the future, but we know right now people are hurting and people have been hurting for decades before this.
Absolutely, and yeah, our data shows that to the point about the ability to bear even a small increase of $25. There has been our survey over the course of 3 years, so 2017, 2018, and 2019, showed that about half, so fluctuating between like 47 and 49%, about half of low-income tenants, so that's 175,000 households, which is, if you multiply it by the multiplier of 2.1, like about 400,000 people, that number of households can't bear a $25 increase. So what that means is that for some people, that the end result over the course of multiple years is an eviction, but for many others, that means a really unsustainable situation where you're paying all of your money towards rent and can't afford to buy food or can't afford to buy a MetroCard. So it's a situation, and that was the situation before the pandemic happened. So things were bad, and things are going to get worse.
I hear your argument, and I'm not disagreeing on some of the facts. But don't you think this is more of a political argument that should be made to the politicians as opposed to the board, whose job is just to look at the numbers, and according to the numbers, there should be rent increases?
So yeah, absolutely. This is this argument is, we're making this argument, lots of groups are making this argument to every single level of government, including the city, the state, the federal government. There needs to be, the RGB as a board can't impact the amount of rent relief that comes from the federal government, right? But what the RGB could do is use the tools at hand to do what it's supposed to do, which is consider the economic situation of the landlords, but also consider the economic situation of the tenants. And the economic situation of the tenants before the pandemic began was already for the kind of the constituency that CSS advocates for low-income tenants specifically, was already really bad. And I think that we have hard data to show that. And we have some kind of rolling data that has been rolling in over the past couple of weeks to show that that situation has exploded. Things have gotten so much worse for tenants over the course of the last 7 weeks.
Oksana, what is that rolling? What are those indicators that you're referring to?
So I've specifically been looking to the CUNY School of Public Health. They have been doing a great survey every single week to look at some indicators across all sorts of different types of fields, including housing, but specifically talking about job loss among low-income tenants and tenants of color specifically.
If you could send Andrew the sites, that would be awesome.
Absolutely, I could do that.
Thank you. Any other questions for Oksana? Okay. Our next speaker, I'm just trying to go back to my agenda. I think our next speaker is Tim. Hey, Tim. We don't hear you, Tim. You need to turn on your microphone.
Take care of that. I thought I was muted on your side. Thank you. And I had a little bit of a technical difficulty. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. Thanks. First, let me, offer my condolences in the passing of Tom Waters. He really was a giant in providing real information, real data, solid analysis to analyze these difficult issues. Precisely the kind of thing that the board needs and which improves the process. And thank you, Oksana, for really an excellent presentation. I think the background is very clear. Tenants are hurting, and they're probably going to be hurting much worse in the coming year. And there's nothing that precludes the board from considering those developments. My focus is a little bit different. I'm going to kind of go back to, the old, I want to say shtick that I have been presenting to the board for the last 5 years. I hope, Andrew, that you've received the updated report. I sent it to you by email just a short time ago, just before the meeting started or as the meeting was started. Included is my submission, as well as an updated table, which I generally refer to as the annualized commensurate rent formula, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Andrew, were you able to get that and forward it to the other board members?
I did.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so let me just read the preliminary statement so we can, focus in on where I'm coming from. And I think it will address some of the issues that were raised in the questions that I just heard. Like so much that has gone on for the last few months, this year's guideline setting process will be like no other. The nation and much of the world is confronted with the vexing problem of temporarily balancing a commitment to the worth and dignity of each human life with the routine but vital freedoms and processes that characterize democratic societies. These are inescapable and none are easy, including in this corner of a disrupted world, the decision to proceed with rent deliberations. I should note that the Rent Guidelines Board staff appears to have once again done an outstanding job compiling data and conducting analysis to assist the board in its deliberations. I was particularly impressed with the updates and additions regarding recent economic developments relating to the misreporting by certain news outlets that the staff had made recommendations, and I'm quoting there, for guideline increases based on the various commensurate rent calculations. I immediately and correctly concluded that this was erroneous reporting because it has never been the staff's policy to make such recommendations. The board and the board alone is accountable for the rent setting process. The staff does not make recommendations, and I believe Andrew McLaughlin's public statements were clear on that. The press should understand that. Some issues are new and many remain the same. Owners will no doubt discuss their challenges, collection losses, legislative changes, and a pattern of rising operating costs. Tenants will provide evidence of pervasive job and income losses leading to unsustainable rent burdens. There will be compelling arguments all around, and as is often the case, agendas may be rationalized by personal or political self-interest. As board members, you are, of course, free to consider all of the information and arguments that are brought to your attention. The law permits practical judgment in weighing both short-term and long-term variables, so long as they are reasonably related to the rent setting process. I will not attempt to address all of those issues here. For well over a decade, I have focused as narrowly and as precisely as possible on the role of the board that it has played in influencing the economic health of rent-stabilized buildings. In doing so, I have taken a conservative approach, isolating and disregarding the deep and pervasive ways the political legislative process promoted higher returns, mainly through laws permitting deregulation of hundreds of thousands of units and through large rent increases related to capital and individual apartment improvements. Last year, for example, while the RGB staff reported that owner net operating incomes had grown by 53.1% since 1990 after adjusting for inflation, I said that the more relevant figure was the gap between the 166% increase in rents needed since 1990 to keep owners whole, preserving net operating income from the effects of inflation, and the 199.55% in increases permitted by the board based upon the board's rent index. This resulted in a general level of overcompensation, which is not as dramatic as the inflation adjusted NOI figure, which incorporate increases resulting from non-rent guidelines adjustments, including deregulation, MCIs, and IAIs. In 2019, the state passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which effectively ended high rent, high income deregulation, eliminated vacancy allowances and longevity bonuses, and dramatically reduced both MCI increases. As I treated Albany's deregulation regime as irrelevant to the guideline setting process in prior years, equally irrelevant are these recent reforms, which have already begun to reduce income levels for owners, although not by that much at present. As is described in more detail below, the central measure of the regulated buildings is the stability of net operating income over time. As the accompanying table illustrates, and you'll see that as the separate attachment to the email that Andrew has circulated. The table illustrates, annual rent guidelines board and vacancy allowances permitted building incomes to cover changes in expenses and preserve net operating income with remarkable precision from 1990 through 2008. This is seen by comparing the closeness of the entries of the last two columns in the table I circulated. The increases needed to prevent inflation-based erosion of net operating income with the increases authorized according to the Rent Guidelines Board rent index. Those figures went from being nearly identical in 2008, and the comparison is 207.75% and 208.36%. That's actually 107.75% increase and a 208.36% increase. To sharp divergence in 2009, where we begin to see the board's authorized increases outstrip what was needed to keep owners whole. What would have been needed to keep owners whole was 208.19%. What was authorized at that point was 223.89%, again above the base of 1990 rents and incomes. And that figure continued to diverge throughout and beyond the recession years, reaching the largest gap in 2015, where there was almost a 40% difference between what was needed to keep owners whole and what the board authorized. During the last recession, while rents throughout the country were basically flat, and in fact, they fell for a 4-year period between 2009 and 2013, tenant incomes were sharply down and rent burdens and homelessness in New York City were reaching record levels. The Rent Guidelines Board authorized the greatest series of unwarranted rent increases in the history of rent stabilization during that multi-year period. 2-year guidelines in 2008 were 8.5%, in 2009, 6%, 2011, 7.25%, and 2013, 7.75%. Again, this was the heart of the recession. Those increases appear to be part of a deliberate strategy to pave the way towards deregulation. They were well outside of the board's administrative charge, and given the human impact at the time, amounted to a disgraceful abdication of responsibility. And yes, I point fingers and cast judgment, because within a few short years, the board had ample evidence that its numbers were way off, creating an unprecedented windfall for owners, illustrated by the growing gap noted above between what was needed to keep them whole and the excess being awarded by the board. Still, the board maintained this reckless course until reconstituted under a new administration in 2015. Fortunately, the newly constituted board immediately began to tap the brakes, and over the past 5 years has moved rents down to where net operating incomes, though still excessive, are closer to their historic balance. As the updated chart shows, in order to keep owners whole, the board would have had to have authorized increases on the order of 175.58% since 1990. The board, in fact, authorized rent increases of 206.92%. Now, in the chart, you're starting with a base of 100, so you'll see the figures of 275.58 being compared to 306.92. That's, in fact, 175% increase and a 206% increase. Over the same period, the proportion of each dollar of rental income devoted to operating costs fell from 63 cents in 1990, and that's an audit adjusted figure, to 60.5 cents as of 2019, the last time for which this is reported. As will be shown, given the aging of the housing stock, this figure should have grown. The sum and substance of these measures is that the board permitted rents to climb to levels significantly higher than the data warranted. The effects of that unwarranted excess are still being felt today. And what follows is basically an updated version of what I've been providing for the last 5 years, including the chart and some recommendations for research. Bottom line is, rents are probably around 5 to 10% higher than they should be or would be had owners simply at least from the board's input, had owners been protected from the effects, their at least net operating income protected from the effects of inflation. Again, this is a highly conservative approach because my analysis does not even factor in the hardship that tenants experienced. My analysis doesn't even factor in the decline we anticipate with the pandemic that's now in effect and the massive losses of jobs. This analysis simply looks at the value of net operating income over time. And the point is that owners have already been overcompensated. And the reason for my anxiety, and in fact, I've said in the past, I was getting to the point of sounding shrill in those years around 2010, 11, 12, when the board was adopting massive increases at a time that incomes were falling. The point is they were unnecessary. And the hardships that were imposed on tenants were unnecessary. They were not a product of data and hard analysis and practical judgment. They were a product of a hostile ideology towards rent regulation in general. It was inexcusable, and the pain and dislocation that was caused really lies at the hands of those people who made those decisions. And again, I congratulate this board for looking at the data, I think, quite a bit more objectively over the last 5 years, bringing things in line. But I want to emphasize that what this board has done since Mayor de Blasio was elected has actually been quite cautious and to the point of being conservative. And if anybody doesn't recognize that, they need to look at the numbers. This is not a radical board which has run away with tremendous concern about tenants and disregard for owners. Fact is, owners got away with an unprecedented windfall. This board has slowly, gradually, too gradually for my taste, begun to correct that, and we need to go further. I'm not going to make a recommendation, but certainly a rent freeze and even a modest rollback would not be unwarranted under the circumstances. And with that, I would recommend that you please read the balance of the report, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Tim, in past years, owner reps have critiqued your report. I can recollect for two reasons, and I'd love to hear your response. One is that the year that you choose as the baseline was a recessionary year, and that's not, the right baseline to use. And the second is that the right comparative is how do owners of multifamily properties in other jurisdictions without rent regulation, how does their net operating income look? And that's the right comparison. How do you respond to those two critiques?
Well, with respect to the choice of 1990, it's not a choice that is made on the basis of some, tactical or strategic, effort. It's a choice that is made because that's the only year for which reliable data first began to be available. Secondly, I don't agree that that this was such a significant recession. The Rent Guidelines Board had adopted a series of fairly large rent increases in the late 1980s, and I believe owners of rent stabilized buildings were benefiting from those rent increases. This was not a particularly liberal administration. The Koch administration took a fairly I say middle of the road approach, perhaps even a somewhat conservative approach to the rent guidelines. And I, as you may recall, I actually was counsel to the board and later executive director between 1987 and 1991. So I'm familiar with what the board was doing at that time. And although there was a dip in the economy, it largely affected co-op conversions. It was not affecting income for rent stabilized properties. The second question, why don't you just repeat it so I can go back
Sure.
to it.
It was that the right comparative is not historical comparative, but how do multifamilies perform in other parts of the country in unregulated markets? That's the right.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'd love to see the data on that, but it's also apples and oranges, and it's apples and oranges for a number of reasons. First of all, the tax load in New York is quite a bit different than it is in other jurisdictions. So I think that, to the extent that taxes are much higher in New York, that may affect the ratio of operating costs to overall rental income. I also think that rents are much higher in general in New York, so that net operating income, even though in relative terms may be somewhat smaller than in unregulated jurisdictions, in absolute terms, the income is still very substantial. And I also would emphasize the fact that this is a city that is relatively older and that multifamily buildings tend to be older, and that it's clear, the evidence is very clear from a number of studies that have been done, that operating costs to rent ratios rise. That is, relative net operating income tends to decline as buildings age. So I think if you were to make an apples to apples comparison, comparing New York City multifamily buildings with buildings, in Ohio or Indiana or something, or Colorado, would probably be a false comparison. I think the better comparison, and I note this and outline it in my submission, is to look at the actual rise in property values of multifamily buildings. Now, this was done briefly. We looked at, I believe, 400 properties. I believe it could be done in a statistically reliable way by looking at sales price data with the Department of Finance, ACRIS filings, and so on. Look at how multifamily buildings have increased in value over the period of rent stabilization. Go back to 1969 and compare it to the increase in value of multifamily buildings nationwide, and compare it to the consumer price index, compare it to the stock market, and I think you will find that multifamily buildings have consistently been a great investment. I noticed I'm getting a notice that I was having an unstable connection. Did anybody miss that last point? Were you
No,
able to
it
hear
came
me?
through, Tim.
Okay.
Other questions
Thank
for
you.
Tim?
I have a question. I'm trying to find it. A tenant emailed it to me. So if anyone wants to go in between, no. Okay, I think I have found it. No, I haven't, but I wrote some of it down. The question the tenant had is, can we ask the city council to amend local law 63 of 1986 to require owners of income producing properties of 6 or more units to file RPIE reports with the Department of Finance? And since you were the prior executive director of the board, I'm directing it.
Well, what is the amendment they're seeking? I mean, we could ask them, we could ask for, a greater number of filings. One of the issues that has come up and the owners have pointed out is that I think it's 11 units or more are required to file. And that's the database that we use to analyze operating costs and income. And so we miss out on some of the smaller buildings. And that's a valid point if you're looking at overall absolute numbers. It's not a valid point, however, if you're looking at year-to-year changes, longitudinal data. So I think the longitudinal study, which shows the trends of income and operating costs, are very robust and reliable. Whereas the cross-sectional probably should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, I do recommend, by the way, that the board revisit the issue of audits and update its estimates of actual operating costs, which we found in the initial set of audits many years ago be somewhat unreliable and overstated. Of course, anyone filing taxes is going to look for hopefully lawfully ways of reducing their income and inflating their costs. And we did in fact find that that was the case with regard to income and expense reporting in connection with property taxes. So the audits should be revisited. I think actually going through or trying to amend the tax law to increase the number of filings or the form of filings is kind of a heavy-handed way to get at what we're really looking for. The DHCR has subpoena power. The rent guidelines boards in outer counties compel owners to submit income and expense filings. And this is a very important point. Owners come before this board every year, and they have in I guess it's now 33 years that I've actually been familiar with the process, and claim that they're losing money, that the board is killing them, that their operating margins are too limited, that the lack of an increase is going to push them over the edge. And in fact, it doesn't. And it's clear from the data that the vast majority of buildings are highly profitable. And my response is at this point, and this used to be, is sort of I suppose a sharp response from the tenant advocates back in the 80s, open your books, you dirty crooks. And I always thought, well, that's a little harsh. Maybe we don't need to do that. We can look for stats and so on. But frankly, after 33 years of hearing the same line of losses and hardship and an absolute resistance and refusal to disclose real numbers, with some selected exceptions. Occasionally, they'll bring a small property owner in who will show their books. We don't get to audit them, obviously, but sometimes they'll show tight operating margin. But we never have an opportunity to randomly select a number of owners and say, let's take a look at what you're making from this property and analyze whether or not the rent guidelines board increases are appropriate or excessive or falling short in some respect. So,
Thank you.
again, if there's anybody in the press listening out there, the owners need to put up or shut up on that point.
Tim, can I just follow up on your discussion of the audit? So are you agreeing with the owner reps who say that reliance on the findings of the 1992 audit of expenses, that the board should not rely on that as an adjustment to its figures?
No, I think the board should rely on that until they're replaced with an updated audit. Now, I understand from staff comments in the past that indeed the level of reporting may have improved, that owners may be more accurate in their submissions, and that perhaps the audits may even overstate the level of misrepresentation of expenses or understatement of income. and that it's time to revisit that. My point here is that the public has confidence in a process that is transparent and complete. What this board does, and it's improved immensely over the last 30 years, is to take a lot of information, make it digestible, manageable, and explain the basis for its decisions. And it's vitally important that those decisions be divorced from political considerations and really relate to the goal of providing reasonably affordable housing and stability in terms of owner incomes to preserve the housing that we have. That's not that hard to do. The problem is often that the process is so clouded with people trying to make political points or engaged in self-serving agendas that they only want the data that serves their arguments. My position is, if the audits are going to be hurtful to the tenants' arguments, let it be hurtful if it's real information. If they're going to be helpful, let it be helpful if it's real information. But in the final analysis, the board should rely upon solid information.
Thank you. I appreciate you answering my question. Thank you. Well, the tenant's question. All right.
You're welcome.
That's all my questions.
Other questions for Tim before we move on to our next speaker? Okay. Barika, you're up.
Buddy.
Hello.
Hi. Wait, let me get situated and get my testimony pulled up here. So hello, everybody. I'm Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director at Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, ANHD. I've testified before this board any number of times, but have been away for a little bit, and now back for a couple of months in this new role. I'm going to try to piece together some things because I don't want to repeat any of the things that that Tim or Oksana have already said before me. So apologies if I end up a little scattered as I skip things live. And then I'll try to send this over to you all quickly. We're obviously in the middle of, as many other orgs are, a number of COVID response, but it was, and last year, Stephanie Sosa, in the past couple of years, Stephanie Sosa has done this testimony before you guys. And she just recently left ANHD for a new exciting role at HPD, but it was very important for me that ANHD still maintain being a part of this panel and testifying before this board. So apologies that we're not all as polished as normally we would like to be, and I prefer to be. So let's see. There we go. For those of you who don't know, ANHD is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 40+ years. We are the association that serves nonprofit community groups across the city that work on housing and economic development. We have about 80+ members that we work and serve across all 5 boroughs and various different neighborhoods. Most of our groups work in low income and communities of color and immigrant communities in the city. Our extensive network includes affordable housing developers. So many of our nonprofit members, actually our founding nonprofit members, are New York City's earliest community development corporations. The 7 original CDCs in the city are ANHD's founders. And our developer members manage over 135 units of affordable housing. So I think it's important to emphasize that we testify also understanding that our membership are building managers themselves and landlords themselves. And we just actually had a member conversation that was sort of joining together our tenants and landlord conversations, thinking about what managing buildings and maintaining services for tenants looks like in the midst of COVID earlier today. And that conversation has spanned as many as 100 different participants. So I am, again, sorry, going to skip through so I don't repeat some of the key things. So I think one of the things to build on some of what Oksana mentioned around this moment in time, and then I'm going to tie back to some of the tools that we normally speak about. I'm gonna not do the rent burden and between both the city and city's general stock and the rent stabilized stock. I think Oksana already captured that, but needless to say, all of our data analysis and the city's analysis itself of HVS only further conclude and capture what Oksana has communicated in terms of, we see that rent burden is higher in rent stabilized apartment buildings and units, and that is heavily focused on low income communities. So we see more units that are severely rent burdened and moderately rent burdened on the lower end of the income scale, those below 50 and 40% of AMI. And that is disproportionately found in our rent stabilized housing stock for the city. I think this is, in this moment in time, it's important to capture that this is all the more stark and critical during this crisis, that data that has been reported by the New York Times compared 1 week in March 2019 to 1 week in March 2020. And there was a 2,637% jump in unemployment claims. A key piece of this is distinguishing between city and state, is that the statewide data is conveying that 2/3 of those filing for unemployment are those making $40,000 or less a year. So this is again heavily filing on our low income tenants and or homeowners. And for us in New York City, that's disproportionately impacting those who live in New York City's rent stabilized stock. So I think it's important to sort of emphasize that we're looking at a tenant population that is bearing the brunt of the impact to employment, the impact to income, and the impact to wages and earnings that is housed in these units, and an understanding that by affordability crisis measures, if we look at the typical renter in New York City earns $47,200. This is from 2017 HVS data. That means that their maximum rent that could be deemed affordable under federal guidelines is only $1,180 a year. So that's sort of our benchmark number to start from. And then we know that that is the population where we're seeing as many as 2/3 share of the total increase in unemployment filings. And that is also the population that is disproportionately unable to absorb unanticipated costs when it comes to thinking about their savings or credit cards or being able to turn to other resources. So I will, I think Tim covered a lot of the pieces that I was going to talk about in terms of the PIOC and the difference between the PIOC and the income expense study. So I'm going to skip through that. Maybe I'll just say it in case it's helpful. One thing that ANHD always testifies and speaks about is that the changes and the difference between the PIOC and how it's consistently increased above RGB's income and expense studies. So I think this is important to understand, is that the PIOC number and the actual income and expense numbers are and continue to be different. So from 1990, when this data was first collected, all the way through to 2018, when it's available, the PIOC has increased by 129.5%, and income and expense is 121%. So we're looking at an overstatement of at least 8% in that 28-year period that we have data for, and that is captured. And what that means in terms of averages is that the average growth cost is a difference between 4.6% and 3.9% in the past 14 years. This is looking at the more recent data. So I think the important thing to highlight is that the PIOC projections are used to estimate the cost of buildings, have continually and consistently outpaced the actual amount that landlords report spending on their buildings. And I think this goes to some of the things that Tim was just speaking to in the questions, and in terms of having to and needing to be at a place where we really say to landlords, you must give this data and be in a position to audit and look at where things really are. The disparity between the projected and actual expense in recent years is significant. And what it's meant is that we have an increase in NOI for landlords over decades, where that is translated into expenses and rent increases for working poor and middle income New Yorkers. One of the things that ANHD really likes to specifically highlight and can speak to, because this is what our members use, is an understanding of the many different tools that are available for landlords to adapt, moderate, rehab, or address capital or maintenance issues in their buildings without transferring that on to increases to tenants. And I think in this moment in time, the emphasis maybe perhaps should be on a conversation about whether or not we need to expand some of these individual resources, as opposed to a conversation around passing these expenses off to tenants, as has been done historically. So the participant loan program provides a 1% interest rate of city capital of up to $90,000 per unit, depending on the affordability. And this funding can be combined with other financing from private lenders. It includes a full or partial tax exemption for moderate or substantial rehab to building systems, structural improvements, and modernization to the building's interior. The HRP is available, so that's housing rehab program, is available for buildings with over 3 units. So this is a key piece, that this is available for many of the smaller landlords who need moderate improvements and a need for reducing operating expenses. This is one of the programs that I think we could see projecting an increased need and desire. It provides a loan with an interest rate of up to 3%. And for projects using this can borrow up to $3,500 per unit and get the full or partial tax exemption as well. There's the Green Housing Preservation Program, which is available for properties with a minimum of 5 units for moderate rehab, energy efficiency, water conservation, to help manage utility costs in buildings. This is one of the resources we know many of our organizations have and continue to turn to, especially in the midst of increased regulation and desire to have more energy efficient buildings that don't contribute to climate change. This is an HPD loan with 2.5% interest, and it includes a full or partial tax exemption depending on how much financial assistance the building receives. And then obviously there's the J51 program. I think we all appreciate that we don't quite know where that program is going to land. It is up for renewal this year, and at a certain point in time, my understanding was that the city was looking at proposals for adapting or modifying the program to put forward at the state level. Obviously crisis hit and it's not quite as clear where that is. But suffice to say, I think the understanding and the thinking was to really modify the J51 program in order to ensure more lasting affordability, but also to adapt the tax exemption to match the needs of buildings and building owners, but then to also ensure that we're maintaining the affordability and not seeing increases passed along to tenants as these buildings continue to benefit from J51 status. Sorry, I feel very jumbled, but I'm trying not to give you repetitive information. So I think it's in this moment in time, we feel like it's imperative to protect the city's stock of affordable housing. And amidst this current health and economic crisis, it's important to further serve affordability and further reinforce the city's commitment to protecting and preserving its affordable housing stock. From some of Oksana's earlier comments, we know that these are some of the most vulnerable tenants, including fixed income seniors and other populations that would be adversely impacted by any type of rent increase, especially in the midst of a crisis when a disproportionate share of this building stock is likely seeing income decreases. You know, our communities, we know that our communities are in the midst of a health and economic crisis. And it's in everybody's long-term interest to ensure their health and economic wellness, as opposed to looking at really trying to maintain what we would view as building profits, as opposed to maintaining building quality and services. So I'll stop there. I know I was a little bit jumping around, so apologies.
Thank you. Questions for Barika?
Yeah, hi, Barika.
Hi.
Hi. So thank you very much for your testimony, especially because you provided some of the answers to the questions that I was looking for in this, and that I was curious about, you know, what are the kinds of recourse that landlords can have in the event that there's a rent freeze or a modest increase. And so we talked about in the during the owner testimonies that the mortgage forbearance, I mean, it's like it just doesn't extend to enough properties, and that, you know, it would require some political will to really expand that in a big way. But you've mentioned several others. So given the totality of all of those options, do you feel that there are a majority of landlords, I mean, it's like the landlords that you would imagine would be in trouble given sort of reduced income from a freeze, from the results of the change in rent regulation last year, all those different sources that have been mentioned? Do you think that there is actually enough recourse for landlords at this time?
So I would separate out the recourse of the impact of this crisis from what the board is considering, right? Because that would present the scenario where the board would be making a determination of rent increases to address the crisis, when that is the same thing that state and federal government partners are deliberating on and hopefully delivering an aid package around. Right, so it would potentially create a scenario where there is what we very much hope to be some rent relief package coming from the federal or state level, and that this board then was passing a something other than a rent freeze that was in some way, shape, or form addressing something that's going to be served by another system of government. Does that make sense? Right, and in some ways, I think we want to separate those two. We wouldn't want can I mimic this? We wouldn't want to try to use a parallel example for hospitals to say we are increasing costs to those sick coming through our doors because of COVID. The answer is that is being addressed through increased resources through aid to localities or directly to hospitals by government, and then hospitals on their own are looking at how to manage their ongoing expenses and operations. Does that make sense? So separating those out, then I think the conversation is, yes, in our experience, if we understand that and the goal and intention is that COVID related expense impact is going to be addressed in a different way, we understand that and believe that the landlords currently have the ability with much of the existing programs to address their expenses with a rent freeze. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and thank you for that distinction as well. I mean, it's like I'm just trying to sort of cast a wide net. I mean, it's like to see, I mean, it's like what's going on that's within our jurisdiction and what's outside of it as well. I mean, it's like to see what the where the balance of burden could possibly be, or at least a realistic balance of burden could be. Thank you.
Hi, Barika. This is Patty. Thank you for your testimony. So I just want to make sure what I think you just said. In other words, you're saying that you're hoping for there to be relief from the state and federal government for both parties, you know, owners, tenants, and that the board should just not be focusing on the COVID and be making their decision based on other factors. Is that what you're saying?
No, I guess what I'm saying is no. So to clarify, I think what I'm saying is that if COVID is the reality, right? And so I don't think it's realistic for the board to be to sort of put on blinders for either landlords or tenants and what COVID's impact has been on either one. But if in the calculations of what a potential rent increase or freeze would look like, the board was incorporating COVID, then that would dramatically and drastically change what the overall math looks like. That's right now, I mean, the city understands that that's unrealistic for them to do within city finances by themselves. It would also be entirely unrealistic for a building to do, for you all to do on behalf of these buildings in and of themselves, right? So let me pull this one up. So this was back of the envelope math to Oksana's point that I think the chair raised earlier. Then we really don't have great ways of getting numbers on what this looks like, what the impact is to rents across the city is. But if you took, there's about, what, 2 million rental units total in the city. If you took that and you assumed that only 5% of units were being impacted, which is dramatically low. We hear that the numbers are somewhere between 25 and 30. And then assume that spreads across 3 months and a rental rate of somewhere between a rental rate of about $1,000, which also is too low, then we're talking about a total bill of about $350 million. It's completely inconceivable that that is somehow made up and compensated by the analysis of this board. That is going to have to come from outside of tenants, and this is the work that we and our groups and many other housing groups across the city are working in collaboration on, the understanding that that's ultimately going to have to come from government.
I thank you, because I happen to agree with you. I think it's the government's responsibility to deal with that issue to help both the tenants and the landlords, and that this board needs to focus on its mandate and deal with the information that we have.
Right, but I think so. The difference, though, is that I would say if you set that aside and set aside all of that COVID impact and that 350 million plus bill, because that's a minimum, and you looked at the analysis just prior to that and just sort of looking at what the income and expenses, the actual income and expenses of a building are, the actual reality of where tenants are, that we would still be in a place of asking for and advocating for a freeze. So I think I want to clarify.
Okay, well, we could disagree on the numbers, but I appreciate your position and thank you for your testimony.
Additional questions for Barika?
Yeah, Bari, I have one. Thank you for testifying. You had mentioned in the beginning that you also do work or represent, or part of your organization also are property owners. In that regard, is there a concern from them about the new rent regulations and how that might impact their ability to have high functioning buildings, or is that something that they feel they can sort of that there won't be as big as an impact as some of the property owners are saying there is?
I would say most of our members were participating in or signed on to many of the calls for ultimately what got passed. And because they use many of these resources, many of the government-backed programs, for them, that's a part of how they regularly approach building operations and maintenance. And then they work with government and the various different government programs around capital improvements. And I think many of them would say that they agree with what you'll likely hear, what I know you'll hear in some of the tenant testimony to follow, that this is now looking at sort of an outpacing that has happened over many years preceding this.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay, so Barika had mentioned tenant testimony, so I think that's what we're going to turn to next. Is that right, Larry?
Hi, David. Sorry, just had to get my cameras in, unmuted.
Sure.
Yes, we have three tenants representing the Rent Justice campaign. They're going to be speaking on behalf of tens of thousands of tenants like themselves. So they're just going to give some brief statements to highlight and put a face on the data that you've been hearing. And then that's going to be followed of a shorter presentation on SRO housing. And that'll be me and Brian, who will be, I see his name is in the corner there, so he'll be joining us in a little bit.
Great. Thank you.
So I guess they can unmute themselves one at a time, but maybe you can call on who you want to, which order.
Okay. I'm hearing feedback. Okay. So I'm not sure if I see names. Hold on. Let me see if Amadi Ozier.
Yeah.
Hey, Rubet. Can you hear me? I'm actually hearing feedback on my end.
Yeah,
actually down there.
Do we know why we're hearing feedback? I'm going to mute everyone. Hold on one sec.
You might be really loud.
Larry, can you mute yourself? I think we're getting.
So my name is Amadi.
Amadi, I had muted everyone else, and so you might want to start over because I may have muted the beginning of what you said.
Okay, that's completely fine. I just wrote something down. I live in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. My name is Amadi Ozier. I've lived in my current rent stabilized apartment for 6 months. I was invited to speak here by Impact Brooklyn. So first, thank you everyone very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And I'm grateful to be able to have the means to talk about this virtually, but I also recognize that this is a privilege. So before I say anything else, I do want to say that I think that RGB cannot meet without disenfranchising many who deserve to be heard. So with that in mind, the governor and mayor should cancel RGB hearings. Separate from that, I cannot afford a rent increase. I was rent burdened even before the COVID-19 outbreak. I live in a pre-war apartment, a converted 2-bedroom with 2 roommates. Even with my 2 roommates, our landlord required us to apply with a guarantor. And even with 3 people, we cannot afford this 2-bedroom apartment without a guarantor. And yet in the past 6 months, I've personally filed over a dozen HPD violations for problems with heat, rodents, and safety issues. And I bring that up just to make clear that it isn't like I live in like a luxury new building or anything like that. But it's still, an expensive place to live. I work as an instructor at a university. Any money I earn on top of my basic annual income depends upon attending academic conferences, teaching, and running summer programs. Because of COVID-19, that supplemental income stream is largely gone. Conferences are canceled, summer programs are canceled. I've been laid off from my teaching appointment in the fall. Before COVID-19, my rent accounted for about 35% of my monthly expenses. My income for the year will likely be reduced by at least 1/3. So my rent is now upwards of 50% of my monthly expenses. Like many New Yorkers, I lost a significant portion of my income because of the COVID-19 outbreak. The outbreak has made getting sanitation supplies and protective gear an added expense and has made everyday tasks and conveniences like buying groceries and doing laundry more costly and time consuming. Both of my roommates have evacuated to shelter in place elsewhere, which means that I'm also now wholly responsible for like apartment utilities on top of everything else. So I want to echo other people who were saying during their presentations that we should consider enacting a modest rent rollback of 3% for 1-year leases and 2% for 2-year leases. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Kim Statuto? Kim, actually, I think I have to unmute you, Kim. Hold on one second. You're unmuted. I think you're muted on your end, Kim.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I am a tenant in the Bronx. I live at 1515 Selwyn Avenue. I am a CASA leader, CASA member, and also a leader on my tenant association. I have been to this board before testifying. I think it's unfair that these meetings are being held. without a full impact from tenants. You only have 3 tenants here today, which is not what would happen if we were doing this in a public space. Let me speak about my landlord and these rent increases, whether they get them or not. I live in a building of 47 units. Last year, we have been going through quite a bit since last year. Last year, we lived without gas for 14 months. This year, during the pandemic's storm hitting at it, we lived for 15 days without heat and hot water. We are in numerous court cases with my landlord, and I represent a great group of tenants in my building who have lost income due to COVID-19. Low income tenants, okay, that can't afford. We are now getting food deliveries when people were actually buying their own food, but now we are depending on food deliveries and things like that. So to even think about a rent increase at this time when people are being impacted is not fair. My landlord rated number 4 on the worst landlords list for 2019. Do I think he deserves an increase? I do not. The money, he has 23 buildings. He does not put his money or profits back into the building. Landlords have been getting profit for over 17 years. This landlord does not put any profits back into this building. It was crying shame that over 47 tenants lived without heat and hot water in the middle of a pandemic when we were being told to constantly wash our hands, constantly that we could not stay inside without heat and hot water. We had to look for shelter elsewhere. There are a lot of tenants like that on my block in particular. Not only that, we have lost a lot of people due to the COVID-19. And do you think those tenants think about what those families are going through? No, they're ready to go in there and gut their apartment so they can get somebody new in there and get a higher price for that apartment. So from my perspective, they don't need a rent increase. We do need a rent freeze. And to have something like this going on, a hearing without a full impact of tenants, is unbelievable that they allowed this to continue to go on. I thank you for allowing me to testify. Hope you take into consideration what tenants are really going through, especially on the low income side tenants. We're not being looked at. I don't have money to pay rent in April. I didn't have money for April, and I don't have money for May. What's going to happen after June 20th when the eviction moratorium is lifted? I'm going to be in court. What can I do? Tell me. And then they want to consider a rent increase? I don't think so. I thank you all. I hope you take it into consideration what low income, what people in general are going through during this COVID-19, because it is not fair. We didn't ask for this. It was dealt to us, and we're trying to deal with it as the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
Rita Marmer? Rita, just try speaking just so we can make sure we can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay, hi. I just wanted to quickly say thank you for the other tenants that I just spoke. I'm in adherence to what they've said. Thank you for allowing me to speak and to hear what I have to say as well. And to reiterate what they've said, I'm speaking on behalf of all rent stabilized tenants. I live in a rent stabilized building. And for the last 17 years in a row, the profit margins for landlords have increased. They went through considerable increases on rent increases in the mid 2010, 11, and 12, which I was a part of and had to pay. And it's time to balance the numbers. Just like the last tenant that spoke, that's low income people. All of us are struggling to not have income. My job has been lost due to COVID. I can't work. I'm struggling to pay my rent, and to ask New Yorkers who, I'm one of the people of thousands that are trying to even get unemployment. And then you're gonna try to have this meeting without the proper tenants probable. And also to consider a rent increase during this time. It's time to balance the numbers. I'm asking for a rent freeze. on top of a 3% rollback for 1 year and a 2% rollback for a second year. It's time to balance the numbers. All of us are struggling. And that's, it's time to be fair. What else can I say? The other two tenants have spoken very clearly, and I stand behind what they have said.
Thank you, Rita. I think Brian Sullivan is going to speak next. Larry, are you going to speak? I'm sorry, Larry.
Sorry. Can we, Larry and Nanny and Brian, sorry, try to aim to be done in half an hour so that we can have some question and answers and hash out some of the earlier points in the morning? Thanks.
Sure. And I want to thank those tenants for speaking up and representing all of New York City's tenants so well. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity for more voices to be heard. But they're right. So many people are going to be precluded from the process this year. And that's it's just not right. But I know the board is struggling as well and trying to do the best they can in a difficult situation. And I do want to start by just thanking the board for their service, which I do every year. So David, Alex, Cecilia, who's been there for a while, particularly Cecilia, you've been on the board for quite some time now. And let me welcome the new members, Christian and Christina. You have a tough job because the landlord reps and the tenant reps are battling for your hearts and minds and for making the right decision. You've heard from experts on both sides about the data. I think the data supports a rollback, at the very least, a rent freeze. And I think if you listen to your heart and what tenants are going through in this city, you cannot increase the rents this time around. So I'm really here to focus though on SROs, and I sent you a lot of material. I hope you got it. And I hope you get a chance to read through it. And if you're new and really don't know what an SRO is or need more background, we'd welcome an opportunity to meet with you offline, as it were, and I can have a telephone call and give you a lot more background. I've been at Goddard Riverside 33 years, and I've been working with SRO tenants since 1984. So it's they're my friends, those tenants. So let me just start. If there's a little within the packet, there's a history of SROs and supported housing. Put the timeline so you can look at that to see the whole history of SROs. And just the big picture is that SRO housing with shared bathrooms and shared kitchens was outlawed in the late 50s, 56, I think it was. The city didn't allow new SRO construction except by nonprofits, because dormitories are basically SROs with the shared bathrooms and kitchens. There was 165,000 units of SRO housing in 1971. And the city and state encouraged the demolition and conversion of SROs because it was seen as substandard housing. In the late 70s, early 80s, there was a recognition that landlords were by any means necessary, and they were really basically terrorizing and harassing SRO tenants. In 1981, the West Side SRO Law Project opens its doors, and the East Side SRO Law Project got established at MFJ. And a few years after that, there was a one-year moratorium on the demolition and conversion of SROs. It was known as the Blackburn Report. And they found 65,000 units were left in 1986. So over that 15-year period from 1971 and 1986, about 2/3 of the SRO stock was lost. And that's when homelessness among individuals started to skyrocket in the city, and the shelter system really started to grow, and seeing people out in the streets, people who were formerly institutionalized with mental health histories, and others were now out in the streets. So now the current estimates, we might have 25 to 30,000 SROs left. Only about 10,000 units are actually registered with DHCR. What has saved and preserved SROs is nonprofits acquiring them and preserving them as supported housing. Now, in the packets that you have, the package that I put together, it's, what does it say there? Yeah, the RGB 2020 packet. If you look at that at one point, the first page of that is a DHCR flyer that explains how rent stabilization works in the SROs, because it is different than apartments.
Do we have the packets?
I sent the packets this morning to everybody. I hope
Right. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so in that packet, there's a DHCR flyer. It's a notice of tenants' rights and responsibilities. SRO owners are supposed to give this out to somebody who's renting a unit in an SRO, although I've never known an SRO owner to actually do that. Now, tenants in SROs don't have leases. They're statutory tenants similar to rent control tenants. An occupant in an SRO unit is considered a transient tenant or a permanent tenant under hotel stabilization. Now, when you move in, you're supposed to be given a notice that you can trigger your rights to become a stabilized tenant. That's known as doing a lease request. And you don't get a lease, and it's not a request. It's a triggering of your rights to become stabilized. It also happens automatically if you reside in an SRO for longer than 6 months. You're considered a permanent tenant. So we always considered this a loophole. We called it the transiency loophole, that owners could rent out to non-stabilized tenants, but it's a provision of the law that's been in existence since the hotel stabilization laws were created in '74. So it's important to know that, because that, what I call the transiency loophole, it's allowed SRO owners to rent to non-stabilized populations. And that's where they make a huge amount of money and why SROs are so profitable. And that's why there's been a rent freeze for 8 years in a row. So owners rent to tourists at daily and weekly rates. Sometimes it's not even allowed under the particular zoning and classifications of their building, but tourist rentals is a huge factor in their income. Others net lease to colleges. Colleges need housing for their students. It's a big issue for thank you. It's a big issue for students moving into New York City. And that's, thank you, Leah. That's the notice that owners are supposed to give out, explaining how to become a stabilized tenant. And then the other great source of income for SRO owners is special needs placements. The city has turned to hotels, and they're turning to them right now in this pandemic to rent units for homeless families. HASA rents SRO units, and these rents can be $3,000 a month. It's just very, very profitable. The next 2 pages there, what Leah's pulling up is from the explanatory statement that the Rent Guidelines Board produces. And the important thing to see in this is there's 5 different types of SROs. There's the Class A residential hotel, which are basically kind of like studio apartments with hotel services. Very few of these buildings left. Most are converted straight into apartment buildings at this point. Then you have Class B SROs, Section 248 SROs. These were built as hotels or converted from apartment buildings into facilities with shared bathrooms and kitchens. And in the other extreme, you have the lodging houses, also known as flop houses, that existed in much greater numbers in the Lower East Side, down on the Bowery. And people live in cubicles that could be 50, 60, 70 square feet, and have a chicken wire ceiling that's separating the cubicles. So there's 5 different classifications of SROs that you can actually produce different guidelines for. I've always wondered why they didn't subdivide apartments into different classifications, because there are different economics between small buildings and large buildings, but that's a different issue. But do look at that to see the different categories of SROs. And another thing in the packet that's important to note, because following this is a chart of the Rent Guideline Board adjustments for the, going back to the 70s. And you'll note that the last 8 years there's been a rent freeze for SROs. And then in the years that there have been a guideline adjustment, there's been something called a proviso, or a condition that would preclude an SRO owner from getting an increase. And I've included in your packet 2 legal memos about these provisos because they've been debated over the years. Now, we got provisos initially back in 1984 around the issue of warehousing, which is withholding, vacant units. We basically argued, if a building is half empty, how could a landlord argue for a rent increase if half the building is empty? They need an increase, rent up your empty units first. And if you still can't make it, open up your books and apply for a hardship increase. So the provisos around warehousing was a way of getting around a one-size-fits-all rent increase, which has always been frustrating for owners and landlords and tenants alike. The other provisos is recognizing that significant percentages of SROs are very profitable and generate enough income that makes the building highly profitable and doesn't warrant an increase on the remaining rent stabilized tenants. So the actual percentage has varied over the years, but if 20% or more of the building is rented out to non-stabilized tenants and generating a lot of income, the board has decided that it doesn't want to increase on those remaining rent stabilized tenants. So it's important to know about those proviso tools. And in the submission, the balance of my submission and the submission from the Goddard Riverside Law Project, you're going to see a bunch of examples of rooming houses and other hotels that really illustrates what I just spoke about and what you'll hear from Brian in a moment. In addition, the Rent Guidelines Board staff, and I want to thank Andrew and the staff there, have put together a series of memos where they've tried to look at whatever data was available for SROs and what the impact of provisos had or didn't have, and also the numbers of units left and the average incomes, etc. So Andrew can forward you those memos if you need them. I've tried to summarize some of the findings out of those sheets. So the 2 pieces of paper that 1 page is, it says part 1 and part 2, is a kind of summary of that information. You'll see the number of units actually registered at DHCR has fallen off year after year after year. It used to be 15 to 20,000. This year looks like for the first time, less than 10,000 units are actually registered with DHCR. We think there's underreporting and that many more units should be registered, but that's the extent of the registration data now. Using that data and data from the Department of Finance, Andrew, they've done their best to try to come up with mean average rents. And the rents are pretty high. And what's interesting to note is despite the rent freezes, the average rents have continued to go up year after year. I think that's particularly true in the case of rooming houses. Many of those tenants don't know they're subject to stabilization, or they move out, a new tenant moves in and the rent goes up, and tenants just don't know that that could be a potential overcharge. But so despite the rent freezes, rents have gone up. And on a square foot basis, SROs are a lot cheaper to operate because you have a single room, where we have 1 common bathroom for 4 different units, 5 different units, depending on the building. And on a square foot basis, they're far more profitable as well. So SRO owners by and large are doing very well. And SRO owners haven't even shown up to testify in a large number of years now. I think we had 1 person last year who spoke about SROs, but so many of them are doing quite well that they just can't justify asking for an increase, and they've stopped coming. So let me hold it at there, and we pass it to Brian, and we'll save enough time for questions. Oh, and I just want to say, to summarize by saying, we implore you to please keep a rent freeze in effect. Thank you. Sorry, Brian.
That's no problem. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Good afternoon. As he is every year, Larry's thorough, so I'll just highlight a few points so we can get to questions and wrap things up. I'm a senior staff attorney at Mobilization for Justice. We, as Larry had said, have a SRO law project as well, where we represent SRO tenants in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and occasionally other boroughs, Bronx and Queens. And I guess the key handful of points that we want to drive home in similarly making a request for a 0% increase for SROs this year is that SROs remain housing of last resort for lowest income, most vulnerable New Yorkers. They are, even though per square foot expensive, their total cost is lower than any other form of housing you can get in the sort of unsubsidized private market. And it is where many of New York's people who live with disabilities live. It's where many seniors live, working poor people, people who without SROs would be in the homeless population. And these are tenants who are not in a position to endure or to absorb any rent increase. So, every year I sort of go through my cases and try and pick out a couple examples. And so the two that I found this year are one of my tenants who, for confidentiality reasons, I'll just say initials are JH, receives a little over $800 a month in Social Security. And their rent is just a little bit over $700 a month. So that leaves just under $100 a month to cover all their other expenses, food, any medical expenses that come up, if a family member needs assistance. That is a razor thin margin on which to live. And this is someone who cannot afford to absorb an increase. I also went for one of my highest income SRO tenants who is on, I was surprised. Normally we don't get SRO tenants who make this much, but he makes $1,600 a month in holding two jobs. He's working poor, and his rent is $915 a month. Now he's got a little bit more wiggle room, but that is still not enough money to buy new clothes for yourself, to make sure you have enough money to eat and that sort of thing. And they're just living on such a thin margin that a rent increase really is devastating. And it will, I think the board has been wise to keep the rent increase at 0%. We can all but guarantee that even a small rent increase will drive some of these SRO tenants into homelessness. These are already vulnerable people who are particularly vulnerable now because of their age or because of health conditions, into the homeless shelter. And it's just not a situation that those tenants or the city can afford, either in a financial or a moral sense. I think it is worth, Larry had talked a little bit about the physical layout of SROs, but particularly for members of the board who aren't familiar with SROs, it's worth highlighting that a little bit. There's a diversity of SROs. They come in a lot of shapes and sizes, but even at their most extravagant, you're talking about one room, maybe roughly the size of a room in your apartment or your house, that sometimes it has a sink in it, generally not. Generally it's you have to go down the hall to use the bathroom, and it gets more humble from there. The sort of traditional Bowery flop house, as it's called, is a massive loft space that's been subdivided into small cubicles that are very, very small. Some of them you can touch either wall, sticking your hands out on either side. And they'll have a chicken wire fence and a door that locks, and all the tenants' possessions are in that small space. Raising rent on such a humble home is not warranted, particularly given some of the vulnerabilities that I talked about before. And the sort of last point I'll make before opening it up for questions is the landlord side or the owner side of the equation. As Larry said, and we repeat this every year, the SRO owners don't, the rent from rent stabilized SRO units is not a meaningful, or at least not a huge source of income for SRO owners. That's why, as Larry said, in I think the 8 years I've been doing testimony before the Rent Guidelines Board, only once has an SRO owner appeared to argue for a rent increase. There are so many other profitable uses of SROs. And I think again, going to the case of some of the Brooklyn SROs, there's sort of an interesting illustration of that. Brooklyn SROs tend to be, they'll look like a brownstone on the outside, but instead of a single family or even one household per floor, the units have been divided up. So there'll be multiple single units on each floor. And the owners of these buildings frequently want to evict their tenants or want to somehow convert this to more profitable use. But the more profitable use they want from this is not marginally higher rents. They want to vacate the entire building in order to convert it to a single family home or whatever it is exactly. The plan is a small increase in the rent, probably even a fairly large increase in the rent, doesn't change that economic calculus for that owner. They're going to try to force those tenants out one way or the other. And so it doesn't make any sense to provide an increase that those tenants, for the reasons I've described, simply cannot absorb, whereas those owners that have a valuable property or that find other profitable uses for the building, they can absorb that 0% increase. It's not going to affect their bottom line in any meaningful way. So as the board has done for the past several years, we ask that once again you do a 0% increase. And as always, really appreciate, particularly this year when I know it's particularly taxing, appreciate your hearing our testimony.
Thank you, Brian. Questions for Larry or Brian? Okay, Shayla said we should maybe move to kind of a broader conversation. So let's just open the floor to a broader conversation.
Yeah, thanks, David. We heard a lot of testimony this morning that around how landlords are doing and their ask for a rent increase from this board. There were some ideas thrown around, and I don't know if the tenants who spoke earlier are still on, but I would like to one say, the idea of thinking about folks using their security deposit seems like maybe in the forefront, a cool idea for folks to be paying for back rent. But I also want to get the impact, and maybe Amadi can speak to this around the security deposit and what it means for people's ability to move when they need to, specifically since many tenants, as mentioned by Barika and others, I think Osana mentioned this also, talking about how tenants are not only don't have savings, but also that many of the tenants that I work with, and I'm assuming many of the tenants that folks who spoke are speaking about, don't actually have the ability to move if it weren't for that security deposit and like the impact of that. And I want to highlight comments made by Amadi about her recent move, because I think it's actually a highlighting, that, many of the folks we're representing are older sometimes, and that's the folks who have the time to come and testify, but that this is actually expansive. And, Amadi, I'm making a judgment on how young and older you are, but, she is fully representative of the upcoming generation of folks who are actually finding it even hard to stay in the city. And, if it weren't for a rent stabilized apartment, I think that would even be harder to negotiate. And so I wanted to get your response or thoughts on that topic specifically, if you can.
Thank you so much. That's actually a great point that I honestly haven't even thought so far in the future that that will make it more difficult to move. Like people, including myself, rely on the security deposit, getting the security deposit back. And with my move specifically, I moved in October, at the very end of October, and I was asked, in addition to having a guarantor, I was asked to pay 4 months in advance. And that was finally negotiated down to 2.5 months in advance. But it's still a lot of money at the beginning that you're sort of anticipating getting back. And so having this, it's disruptive in a lot of different ways. I guess whenever people move, or at least this used to be the case, whenever people move, you're expected to put down thousands and thousands of dollars in advance. And you're kind of relying on getting your security deposit back from the last place in order to make that work. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make financial sense, because how are you going to pay the security deposit for your next place if you don't have the security deposit from the last place?
Thanks. And
Well, can I just make a comment about the security deposit? I think I just want to make something clear on the use of the security deposit. Owners are not waiving having a right to a security deposit. They're just saying if you need to use your security deposit now to pay the rent, and then you'll slowly pay back the security deposit so that when you do move later on, you will have the return of your security deposit.
thanks.
I think, oh, sorry. I was gonna ask a quick question, but if you wanna go ahead?
No, you can go.
All right. Well, we can, as always, agree to disagree, but I have a separate question, and this was brought up a little bit earlier, about the factoring in the new rent reform laws, and using them specifically as a reason to justify rent increases in the context of, because we had HSTPA, landlords are not able to do certain things that they would have done beforehand, specifically before and after the pandemic. And that's the reason why, in particular, now is the time for higher rent increases. I think that is how it was framed earlier, and I would love for the folks who are testifying now to speak to that. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's important for the board to hear.
I don't know if any of the people that spoke this morning are still on, but I'll respond to that.
Well, does anyone, I don't know, Brian, are you still here? No, Brian's not.
There he is.
I am here, Leah, but unfortunately,
Okay.
I lost you for a big portion of what you said. My internet
Oh,
wasn't
so I was wondering if you could speak to this idea that because of the rent reform, because of the HSTPA, and because of some of the measures that was put on to protect tenants, that is now being used and factored in as a reason to increase rent. And so the specific example that was given was, with preferential rent beforehand, a landlord might offer preferential rent before the pandemic. But since after the HSTPA, a landlord is hesitant to do that because it would be for life. And so because of that, we need higher rent increases. That was one example that was given, but I think the general gist of it is because of the rent reform laws, we need higher rent increases. Tenants got to win. So now there needs to be some sort of balance. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
So going, just taking a note for myself here. So taking that in sort of two parts, I mean, the preferential rent question seems pretty straightforward to dispense with, because if the landlord just wants to forgive a portion of the rent instead, they're welcome to do that. You don't need to enter a preferential rent agreement to say, I'm just not going to either collect rent for these months or a partial rent or whatever. You wouldn't be entering a lease with a preferential rent. You wouldn't be fixing the rent for the foreseeable future or anything like that. So that's perfectly available if they want to do that. And there's nothing about the new law that would prevent landlords from, if they feel like doing it, providing the tenants with that relief. I think another key point is the level of sort of economic devastation tenants are facing is so vast that a small decrease in the rent for the vast majority of tenants who've lost all their income is not going to be particularly meaningful anyways. They need longer term fix to that, which it is within this body's power to do. In terms of the broader issue of the landlords, and because the HSTPA was helpful to tenants, gave tenants a new set of rights, was a win for tenants, that landlords need a something now. Again, I don't think it really follows. The key thing I'd point to is I logged on to the end of Seth Miller's testimony, and I think he made a good point that the reality is, and actually some of the tenants had pointed this out as well, the reality is residential real estate in New York City has been an incredibly lucrative undertaking for landlords. They've made a lot of money over the years and still stands, it likely continues to be a lucrative undertaking for landlords. And so there really isn't a need to somehow offset the gains of the HSTPA with a rent increase here. It's the benefit to tenants is warranted given the many years of exceedingly profitable operation for landlords, and giving tenants a break, and giving tenants, particularly in the current circumstance, some economic security is appropriate right now.
Thank you.
I guess I wanted to try to address that a tiny bit too. I think the fixes to the rent laws were long overdue because it led itself to a lot of speculation by people buying buildings and corporations buying buildings based on its future value of displacing tenants and deregulating the units. Buildings are very profitable. You can see by Tim's analysis and presentation, the return on rent stabilized housing is tremendous. And owners opt in. I mean, if they're taking 421A or J51 benefits and subjecting themselves to rent stabilization, they're not doing it because they're going to lose money. They're doing it because it's profitable and it guarantees an income stream. I think a lot of the fixes were overdue. Some of my fellow tenants said, well, landlords are going to stop harassing folks because we don't have vacancy decontrol anymore. I hope that's true. But if you're a tenant with a preferential rent, there is an incentive for the landlord to get you out because they will be able to raise it up to the legal stabilized rent. And the same for the remaining rent control tenants. They got it fixed last year that they don't have to pay the very high 7.5% increases they had every year. But if the landlord can get rid of one of those 20,000 rent control tenants left, they're also able to float it up to some sort of fair market formula before it becomes stabilized. So there's still an incentive to displace preferential tenants and rent control tenants out there. That's, in my mind, still needs to be addressed. The notion of a rent deposit covering somebody's rent, that's just kicking the issue down the road. And it's a drop in the bucket compared to the need out there. It's very clear we're going to need some rent relief out of Washington and Albany to deal with what I'm calling the dam bursting. When they list a moratorium on evictions in June, it has to be extended, and we need some sort of relief from those tenants. Courts, there was an average of 15 to 20,000 filings a month. It was down to about 15,000. But if it's pent up for 3 months and so many people have lost income and jobs and have not been able to afford the rent, I think the number of tenants actually on rent strike is dwarfed by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of families who just cannot afford the rent by default. So we have a huge pent up issue. And when the courts reopen, it's going to be like a dam bursting on potential evictions. But those are issues that have to be fixed by other entities besides the Rent Guidelines Board. I refer you to go back to Tim's testimony. I think owners have done very well by the increases that the board have granted over the years, and is a very good argument to make that they've been unduly overcompensated, and it's time to level the playing field. And if some landlords take it on the chin, that's okay in my mind. There is provisions for them to apply for hardship increases and to get rent increases outside the RGB system.
I actually would like to pick up on that, because that's something, I mean, I've noticed that one of the common themes throughout all of the testimonies from on the tenant side has really been that past imbalance. I mean, it's like between what the RGB has allowed and, estimates on, what landlords have actually needed to be made whole. So, this is a situation where I wish, it's like that the people who testified this morning on the owner's side, it's like we're here to add to this discussion. But I guess, it's like for Patty and Scott, do you think that this is something that's relevant today? It's like, given what's going on with landlords today, right now, what is your response in terms of how those past increases translate to today, right now?
Oh,
Patty, you're,
Patty, you're muted.
yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. In response to what's going on today, obviously, this is, to say the word again, unprecedented what's going on today. But I think it needs to be made clear that owners go into business not to be made to be zero, to be made whole. This is, democratic society, not a socialist society. Owners do not buy buildings to just break even. They go into buying buildings to make a profit. Putting that aside, and we hear a lot of what the tenants are suffering and losing their jobs, and obviously that's true. I'm not debating that, but owners still have to pay their employees, run the buildings properly, provide heat, hot water, all services, pay their taxes, pay their water and sewer. The union just got an increase. Everything goes up. So to say that this terrible thing is going on, and everybody has to acknowledge it's a political issue, and the government needs to really compensate and help the tenants that are in need. It's not the owners' jobs to make the tenants, whole, because they can't do that. They need to worry about their business. And to say that the owners should just waive rents, owners should not waive rents because they're not getting waived their real estate taxes or their water and sewer charges or anything to that extent. Obviously, owners are doing their best to help the tenants. They're keeping their buildings clean. They're, extra cleaning and doing whatever it is, to prevent the virus from spreading, and to the best of their ability, they're helping. But owners are going through what they're going through as well, because this virus is not only affecting tenants, this virus is affecting the entire society. And it's very important that that's kept into the conversation, and that is something that needs to be considered as well. And I think what we need to focus on is that the numbers show that owners would be entitled to an increase this year, and that the HSTPA did affect what owners make, and we can help that in certain ways by giving back the vacancy increase, which would maybe offset or lower guideline increases. And it's not a made up argument that the loss of being able to stop a preferential rent would stop an owner from offering a preferential rent now, because then the preferential rent stays until the end of the tenant's tenancy. So, yes, the tenants had a big win in the 2019 Rent Act, but they have to realize they might have gone a bit too far, because if vacancy increases were still permitted, and or if preferential rents didn't have to be for an eternity, things might be a little easier now for owners to help the tenants a little bit more. So what I'm saying is everybody is affected by this pandemic. Everybody, not just tenants, owners too. And we have to keep that in mind. And we have to look at the real numbers, because we are not a political board. We are not here to make policies. We are here to mandate increases based on what the numbers show. And I think that even though that is hard on a personal level, I think we have to do our jobs. That's all I'm saying.
I have a quick point. Thank you, Patty. I think something that Tim Collins said earlier really resonates here, which is that a rent freeze is not actually a very radical position. If this board wanted to, we would arguably be well within our rights to have a rent rollback, a 100% rent rollback, which is part of the cancel rent campaigns that have been going on. That would be actually very radical, and that would actually be a systemic measure to help what's going on. So in light of that, just telling folks that they will pay this coming lease cycle the same rent that they're paying right now is quite a moderate position. And just to sort of sum up, because I don't want to talk a long time, I'd like for the tenant advocates to speak. I think, as Patty mentioned, people go into business to make money. So if we were to look at what we're balancing, we are balancing people's lives and whether they're going to be kicked out over a minimal increase, as was testified to earlier by Barika, versus a business venture, and versus whether someone is going to make more money. So if we were to look at things in balancing scales, I think that it's pretty clear whether we're going to put people's lives, these people that we're clapping for at 7 p.m. every night, who are the people who are living in rent stabilized apartments, or are we going to make a decision based on increasing someone's profits? So with that,
Well, with that, I just would like to respond, please. I think I'd like to respond to that. Because,
you can tell. Can you tell that we're two lawyers? Can you tell? Can you tell? I don't think you can. I think it's not very clear.
Sorry, but can we give it the back and forth from board members?
To that? Can I just respond first, please?
I just wanted to.
Objection.
Well, I'm objecting to be interrupted because I was speaking. I just want to say that although owners go into business to make money, I think you're taking what I said a little out of context. Right now, they're obviously not going to be making money because there are going to be many tenants that are not paying the rent. So I think it's not a matter of giving owners an increase so they could make more money. It's trying to keep a balance is what I'm asking for, a balance of there's tenant issues and there's owner issues, and many of the tenant issues are going to be addressed by the government. What I'm saying is we are not—
Landlord issues can be addressed by the government as well.
They
and
could
property
be,
taxes and all of those.
There's no discussion of that right now. There's no offer of that. There's no real estate reductions on the table. There's no water and sewer reductions on the table.
That's not for the tenant reps to bring up.
But everyone just assumes that every landlord is wealthy, and that's not the fact. Are there some landlords that are wealthy? There are, but are there some landlords that are just making ends meet? And I think that that's what has to be balanced. It's not only if a tenant is not working, giving them a rollback does not help them at all. If they're not bringing in any income, a rollback doesn't help them, nor does a rent freeze. It doesn't help them. The government has to help the tenants that are in need. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying that we have to keep, it's sort of like being honest.
I completely get what you're saying. I do want to acknowledge, though, that since we have folks on the line who took time out of their day here to come and testify, that we want to give them. It's really good to have a back and forth, but we do want to give them some more opportunity to speak. So I'm wondering what some of the tenants think about the discussions that we're having. I don't know if I cut out, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Any of you think about the conversation that we're having about basically what to factor in, what the board should factor in making its determination of how much, if any, to increase a tenant's rent by.
I think Alex was trying to say something earlier too. I'm not sure.
Alex, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, I can happy to wait until the tenants comment. I just had one comment I wanted to make.
No, that's exactly what I wanted to open it up to see if any other additional folks had questions.
Yeah. One comment that was, I think the people from CSS or maybe Barika mentioned is the landlords do have the opportunity to reduce or exempt their property taxes by participating in the HPD's programs, such as the participation loan program and others. And, the landlord reps pointed out that, or the witnesses that, property taxes are what, 30% or something of operating costs. And I'm curious to what extent rent stabilized landlords, especially smaller ones, actually participate in these programs, which would exempt them from property taxes. And anyway, so I just think that it's an opt-in. I mean, I don't know if it's unlimited availability, probably not, but it is something that landlords potentially have available. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up.
Alex, if I can actually piggyback on that question, because I sort of had a similar one, is, there's been a lot of talk today about government programs that people can access, but I think one of the problems that I've been hearing about in the media, at least, and I would love to hear from the tenants or the tenant reps, is, you know, accessing unemployment is difficult. The website is crashing continually, all of that. And so I guess similarly, accessing the landlord programs, is that also, you know, is it really, it's the government. I assume it's not just like a click and you can access these programs on either party. And so I would love to hear some sort of more information about that. Like these programs might exist, but are they really that accessible for any party right now?
Well, the answer to that is partially yes, partially no. So I think if the board wants to have a deep dive into all of these programs so that we can prove out how many people can't qualify for them, then I think the public member should make that request to the research team to do that. I think it's a great question, but I think the way it's presented, that it's just these are ubiquitous programs and everyone can get into them, is just factually not true. I mean, it almost makes me angry, the way that it's presented. So let's have a conversation about what units really are eligible for it, and then I think it's a discussion point.
Thanks.
I was going to say, I think it's worth bringing up that a lot of the proposed legislation, specifically to cancel rent, rent AKA rent forgiveness, because I think a lot of these terms end up being sound interchangeable, are actually including a measure for mortgage payments and small commercial tenants as well. So a lot of these proposals are comprehensive and they're not solely for tenants. And a lot of them, I know we talked a little bit about means testing before, but the specific one from Representative Gianaris is tailored towards people who have been impacted by COVID. So it wouldn't be something for every single tenant. So I think it's important to bring that up, because we've been I think the nature of the board can manifest itself to very, tenant versus landlord. But I do think it's important to recognize, since we're talking about different forms of relief, that the specific things that have been put forth recently in the last couple of months have been things that address both the needs of tenants and landlords.
I would actually like to take up, what Scott said. I think it would actually be a great idea, if, to the extent possible, for the RGB staff to actually look at the extent to which different properties would be able to access, these different kinds of relief. Just to put that on the table. Again, it's just to have that data as an important piece of evidence that we can use to see how our decisions are falling, either on the landlord side or the tenant side. If to the extent that that's possible, that would be great to do. But of course, I'd leave it up to the staff to let us know how much of a burden that would be, or whether that can be done.
So just to be clear, we want the staff to identify programs to assist building owners in distress and to see if there's any data about the take-up of those programs. Is that the question?
Yeah, it's like Scott, it's like, maybe some more details from you would be great. It's like, but what I'm hearing from what Scott is saying is that not all landlords might qualify for different kinds of programs. And so the idea would be, if programs were made of, if additional programs, given the programs that are available, and given any sort of existing possibilities for programs, to what extent do landlords have access to those or not? Is this a case where truly any landlord that finds themselves to be in distress can access these programs? If that's the case, then, landlords have recourse. But if it's the case that you have a certain number of properties or a certain share of properties that are not able to access these kinds of recourses, then that's something for us to take into consideration. We talked this morning, for instance, about how the mortgage forbearance is only accessible to a fraction of landlords. So there's one example there, but what are some other examples for some other programs?
I mean, I think the staff could look at that question, and there certainly seems to be a lot of interest in it. I'll just tell you my own guess is that there's going to be very little data on take up yet. I mean, as of now, there's just so little data even on default rates of lenders, you know, because we're like in the default stage, and until we get to May May mortgage payments and June mortgage payments, my guess is there are going to be very little data. But we could certainly see what the programs are and what possible outcomes there might be.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Hey, I mean, I think I think more data is always best on my purview, because I think we should be making a decision that's best to simulate a fair housing market in the city. But I think that even in us bursting out like what small owners are compared to the larger context of what rent stabilization is, we are talking about creating some other alternative mechanisms to address that need. I think that if we ultimately also think about that, I think we should think about the flip side of also like, what does it actually mean for different renters across the city to have increases, right? And so if we know that rent stabilization on average, it takes about $800 to manage the unit, then, you know, at some point, are we making decisions on capping rents, because now we're surpassing what even breaking even looks like in with the data that we have. And I think that those, I hope that as a board, we continue to have a conversation about small owners, but even the small owner we heard from today owns a building, which on, you know, HPD's website says 125 units. He mentioned he has 90 units, 30 of them are rent stabilized. You know, 10 of those rent stabilized are actually have scree or dree, so our decision is not going to impact them greatly. And so that small landlord actually owns 20 rent stabilized units, and the rest are he's able to negotiate in a different way and get relief in a different way. And so I just want to make sure that like as we have these conversations, yes, we want more data. Yes, we want to get a full breadth of what's happening to rent stabilization. I also want us to do that with the same brevity that we're doing it for landlords, for tenants, because we're not even like earlier we were having a conversation about forget COVID, forget the impact of that. And now we're having the conversation for small owners about, let's see what the impact of this is on them. And so I think that we have to sort of parse out all of those arguments to be, you know, fair, that, you know, we have data that shows that landlords have been overcompensated. We have, NOI has remained above 40% for a long time. And even when we had a rent freeze, we're seeing NOI decrease a little bit, but we're still hitting that 40 mark, which is higher than a lot of other businesses across the country, across the world. Like people come to invest in rent stabilization here because you make money, not because you don't make money. And it's true, there are some small landlords hurting out there, but there are reliefs and spaces for those landlords, and they would have to open up their books. And I think some of the conversations on why don't they tap into these services, I think has to do a lot with, I don't want to open up my books. Once you open up your book, a lot of the applications actually get denied. One year we had 2 and 1 was denied because for some reason, maybe they didn't do the paperwork correctly, but I wouldn't say that the application for owners to talk about you know, restructuring rents to the DACR is a lot more complex than an overcharge complaint that tenants have to go through, or a PAR decision that tenants have to go through with DACR, taking their landlords to court for repairs, like you heard from Kim, who, you know, in the middle of the crisis still had no heat and hot water after having their landlord in court for over a year, and, you know, and with no gas and no heat and hot water. So I want to make sure that like we have a balanced conversation about this, because there is a perspective of a business venture being a venture, and then there's a reality of what does it mean for us to have more homeless people in the street and the impact of that in our system, in our city. And I think that that matters. And I know I hear the argument of our mandate is to increase rents. I hear that argument, but that isn't our mandate. That's not what is legislated. And I think that that's a real thing that we have to sort of grapple with, that like when we have these conversations, we have them in silos depending on who we're speaking of. And you saw the folks we're speaking of, and you will see more of those folks when we have the hearings, and hopefully people will continue to participate and share their stories, because I feel that, you know, it's even more important in the context of what these impact will be for tenants long term. You know, someone making $15 an hour is not going to get back on their feet in 6 months. I don't know if anyone has made $16 an hour. I've never made that when I was a minimum wage worker. And so I could imagine having a family and feeding and, you know, thinking about moving and dealing with medical bills and all that stuff compiled on top of COVID. And I don't think that this, like to Leah's point earlier, I don't think there's a scale to measure out. I think the data, the numbers that we have right now that we've used in the past to increase rents for tenants are the same numbers we have today. And so if we want to just look at what happened before COVID, let's do that. If we want to look at how tenants were struggling before COVID, let's do that. But let's not go back and forth of when it benefits us to talk about COVID, specifically when we have to make a decision that really impacts so many Americans. And, you know, people look to New York City as a guiding hope of what, you know, other cities should do. And I also wanted to just bring up a few data sets that came out of, you know, 0 and 0, like there was a conversation earlier about is a 0 okay? Is a 2-year lease 0 also okay? You know, other counties have done this. Westchester County Rent Guidelines Board adopted a 0 and a 0. And a 0 and a negative rent for 1983. This is like before I was even born. And they did it again in 2010. Westchester also adopted a 0 and a 3 in 84. Nassau County has done the same with a 0 and a 0.5 in 2010 and again in 2017. You know, there is precedent for us to be looking at 0 as a real standard to have a conversation when the numbers bear it. And I don't know how we see the addition of, you know, from 1991 to now and think that everything is going fine for tenants and everything is so hard for landlords in this moment.
I have a question for the public members. Since you've heard from a wealth of the experts today, and in particularly from tenant advocates, I'm wondering if there are any key issues that stuck with you, or if you have any remaining questions, since we kind of only have this meeting until at least a preliminary vote. I'm wondering what resonated with you, if anything at all that you heard today, or any key issues.
I actually did just, it's not so much an issue, but I had a question more about, specifically about the SROs. So I know Brian sort of described, you know, I'm picturing sort of either like a single room, like say a small room, and then a long hallway with like the common bathroom at the end of the hall and maybe a common kitchen. Is that a correct sort of one type of SRO? I have actually seen the SROs that are the cubicles with the wire on top that I've actually seen. And then, and I'm picturing that, and is that the type of space where the landlords are charging this $900 or $800 a month or a month for?
Yeah, that's right. What you described would be sort of what I think of is the brownstone style SRO, just because it looks like a brownstone on the outside. You walk up the hallway, there's a door, down the hall is the bathroom, and others that more or less fit that description might look like large hotels. You know, look like a humble hotel. Those hotels would tend to have lower rents by and large, although seeing, you know, $600-700 is not uncommon. In the brownstone ones, yeah, you would. It's, you know, my clients who had the higher rent that I had mentioned during my testimony lives in a brownstone style SRO, and yeah, the rent would be that high for some of those.
Yeah, those are brownstone SROs. They're the rooming houses. Those are the buildings with less than 30 units according to the RGB definitions. And those rents are high. If you look at the memos that the RGB produced, the rents run significantly higher in the rooming houses than the hotels. And a lot of the remaining hotels, they've become de facto naturally occurring retirement communities. I think the average age of SRO tenants have really gone up over the years, because it's very, very difficult in the hotels, at least, to rent a stabilized unit. Owners really screen people out because they do not want to see people doing lease requests. So if you're a tourist, they want to see you have a return ticket to go back to Germany, or, you know, wherever you may have come as a tourist. If you got a New York license, a New York credit card, you are not going to get a rental because they're so nervous about lease requests. There's the Imperial Court Hotel on 79th Street. It got some publicity about this issue about lease requests. And we cite the owner, that the owner of that particular building brags about the fact that they have so much money they can afford to keep the building mostly empty, and there'll never be another rent stabilized tenant in that building again. That's in the submissions that you can look in the data. The buildings that are larger than 30 units, that's where the city is right now turning to bring homeless people in and to increase distances. I'm dealing with a number of SRO tenants who are very scared about their buildings becoming repopulated with folks coming out of the shelters. But it's necessary. We have to get people off the streets, and we got to get people out of the congregate shelters. But owners are making a huge killing on that because of the huge amounts of money the city has to pay to accommodate those placements.
So we're coming up to exactly, as Larry spoke, a turn to 3:30, the end of this portion of our hearing. I'd like to talk about our public hearing a little bit. This is a topic that we discussed in our last meeting as well. I'd like to just thank all the panelists who joined us today, and then turn just briefly over to Andrew to give an update as to where the staff is in terms of planning our virtual public hearing. So thank you to Larry and to Brian, and to, I think they're the only two ones still on the phone of our panelists. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good luck.
you.
Andrew, I think you have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long this will take. I mean, I can give you a summary. I think it may be a quick discussion. I don't know if anyone needed a quick break to use the bathroom or whatever, or to just get up and stretch, but I can start to go into the conversation if you'd like, or
I'm going to just suggest that people who need to take a break just give themselves a break, because I think probably all of us would like to finish up for the day. And so if I know, yeah, I would just recommend that we just kind of try to get to the end of this.
Sure. So yeah, so staff and we've been working with David and different, throwing different things out here and listening obviously to what the board members requested, and to offer the most access to the board for people to comment. So what we've done, first we'll take what you can do to submit comment to the board outside of hearing, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the hearing part of it. So normally outside of a hearing, it's just written testimony that is presented in public, in comment to our preliminary guideline. So normally we would do that in a very, you could email written testimony, mail written testimony in. So that was, the basic way we did it. So try understand that the time that we have left, and considering that we want to hear from as many people as possible, we're also going to offer two additional options. One where people can comment by calling a phone number and leaving a message up to 2 minutes long, as though they're presenting their 2-minute testimony. These will then be turned into audio files and will be given to the board members so they can listen to it at their leisure. At the same time, we're offering an option for people to submit video comments as well, where if you go to our website, that you would click on a link and you would be able to upload a video that you have created. Again, we would ask folks to leave it to 2 minutes as though they're testifying in front of the board. So that would be an additional way that people would be able to comment. Those two types of comment, along with the traditional written comment, would be available once the public notice went out. And so that would be something that would be done. People can comment, as soon as it's in the city record and going forward. So that was one side of it that we've taken care of. we hope we're meeting the needs of what the public members wanted. The other is having a public hearing. And the idea behind that would be a similar situation where we're doing with Zoom, where people would need to sign up in advance for the hearing. They would be allowed into the hearing depending on whether they wanted to phone in. They could do it by a phone in like they normally listen to a meeting that we have with the public, or like today with the tenant folks who have testified and all our panelists who testified, they would be let in and they would get their 2 minutes to testify like they would be at any public hearing that we've had before. They would have to register before the hearing. And that would be opened at this point. We would open the registration on June 1st. So they would have from June 1st to roughly June 9th at this point of being able to register for the public hearing. At the same time, we
Just
would
to clarify,
provide.
Andrew, you said that in order for tenants to testify, they would not be able to register on the day of the hearing. They would have to register ahead of the hearing.
Not just tenants, but everybody, correct. There wouldn't be a way to register the day of the hearing. They would have to call up. We have to be able to let them into the Zoom. Also, we would provide simultaneous Spanish translation, so you could listen to the entire public proceeding, either in Spanish or English. And then, we would accommodate for whatever other requests, either for other disabilities or for other different languages, if they needed some sort of translation. So that was, and people could sign up for the hearing, not just online, but they would be able to call our office or email as well. So there'd be 3 different ways that people could actually register for the hearing.
I'm sorry, I have one question, Andrew. You said something about June 9th. I thought the public hearing was June 16th. Am I
Well,
wrong?
that's a discussion I'll have David lead about the timing of all this, but I'll let him go into that. So
Where did we get the day of June 16th from? That's the first I'm hearing of it.
That's what I had in the schedule.
it was a preliminary draft schedule that was sent to everybody, I want to say in the beginning of April. That was the date that was originally on there. But I'll have David talk to that. And then, so that would be the different avenues that we would have for people. It would have to be a decision by the board about the length of hearing and whether you want to stay on. We would have to, have that discussion as a board, and you folks could decide how you want to go forward with that. But so that's what we've done as a staff. I think everything that we mentioned is something that we can certainly accommodate and we can do. So David, I'll throw it back to you.
Oh. You're on mute, David.
The only thing I have to add to Andrew is that the date in the draft schedule is just a draft date, and we're still trying to finalize which is the day that makes the most sense. I think there's a sense that we want to kind of move as quickly as we can, and we're just trying to finalize a schedule that allows us to do that.
I did not understand in my previous conversation with you, David, or conversations in general, that we were assuming that folks would have to register ahead of time. And so I would ask Andrew if you can give us a breakdown of how many tenants actually register ahead of time and end up testifying, so that we can figure out if that is the best solution for us to actually have engagement from the tenant folks. Because my understanding, and you can correct me, Andrew, but we tend to have to register folks on the day of, and different hearings have different process on how to do that. And then if that's not allowable, then we'll end up hearing from the first few people who tend to register ahead of time, who aren't the folks it's just a handful of folks that I have ever seen register ahead of time that way. And of course, that depends on the hearing. I know Manhattan is different, but I think the demographics of that is also something I'm concerned about. And I would also think about if we're talking about, we think so many people could potentially testify, like what if that date doesn't work because people have to work or anything, we're only giving them one opportunity that they would have to have register ahead of time to testify. And that doesn't seem open and flexible to me or enough. And so I'm gonna go back and speak to folks, but folks are actually asking for us to host multiple occasions to hear from tenants, and like we do at borough hearings. And then on top of that, I don't think registering ahead of time is good enough because of the numbers that my understanding is we don't have all of the people who testify in any hearing end up registering ahead of time. And that's never been an expectation we've ever had. And so I think that's going to have a dire impact on who we hear from too.
What are the obstacles of registering before the hearing?
Andrew, the same obstacles that they've been every year. Folks show up at the hearing, they don't know about it. They're hearing about the hearings from us. Now we are not able to be in their buildings to let them know about those hearings. And now we have to call them to let them know about the hearings. And so I think it's just the same it's the same difficulties that people have registering for hearings on a normal year.
The issue that we have no real control of the order, though. People would just come on and we wouldn't have any idea of an order. So people would be waiting and waiting and waiting. That's our big problem with it. And there would be really no way for us to, we want to try to be representative of folks. This includes public members, owners, and tenants. So we want to make sure that we have representation to hear from all those different groups, and registering is the way that we know that would work.
I mean, it might make sense to propose alternatives because there's just not I just don't think there's a best answer. So, one thing that the staff was considering was, should we just call on people randomly? So, a bunch of people come on and then you just randomly choose someone to speak. And that's fair in one sense because nobody gets any kind of preference. But then, as Andrew said, then you might log on at 5 and you don't get called till 9, and that's tough, very tough, and a lot of people will probably drop off. And then the most recent iteration that Andrew came up with of having registration, it gives people a lot more of a sense of when they're going to be called. So I hear what Shayla's saying, but it's unclear that there's a perfect solution that matches our live hearing schedule, I guess.
How much in advance do people have to give notice that they'd like to testify? I think I heard a week. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, we would have it up to like midday before the day before the hearing. They would have plenty, we only need like 24 hours to like get it all in order. So when we start the hearing, we're all set to go. So, which is the normal thing that we do for our pre-registration, is it's always noon the day before the hearing. And that's what we've done in the past when people have pre-registered. So we've kept that in place.
And can I make a recommendation, since we think we would need more than the 3 hours or so that's scheduled? Maybe instead of it going till midnight, maybe we can open it up a little earlier than 5 o'clock, since many people are now either working from home or out of work. So maybe if we could start it in the afternoon, so it doesn't continue till midnight.
I think Alex has his hand up as well.
I think that's a good suggestion. To be clear, I understand. So with the pre-registration, people would have a rough sense of the time in which they would be able to testify. That there would be, given whether it's done randomly or first come first serve, people would be given a number or a time. Is that correct, Andrew?
Well, in the past, we've given out a number. So people have an idea. We're a little hesitant to give a time because,
totally understand.
Yeah, because if people did register and then don't show up.
When they go on to YouTube or something.
Right, and we certainly don't want people to sign on and they've missed,
right.
And
it'll be
we don't want gaps of time, so that's why.
But the obvious, so if someone goes on to the YouTube channel, we'll see what the number is of the person who's testifying.
Yeah, they could keep it up that way. We would also plan to have a screen up where we would tell people where we are. We would give maybe upwards to even the 10 next speakers that we have that are coming up so that they know where they are in the queue. So we would have that as a screenshot, as well as, you know, with the 2 minutes, we would have, I believe we'll be able to do a 2-minute countdown timer on the screen as well. So people will be able to see that as they're going forward. So we're trying to, you know, we would try to give them as much notice as we can that their time is coming up.
Okay. Now, do you have a sense like what the max, if assuming it's, let's say, 4 hours, do we have a sense of what the maximum number of people that can testify within that time period? And if there are more people than that who register, what the options would be? Do we just kind of have a hard cutoff, or do we make it more elastic? So that's one question. And I guess my final point is going back to this issue of being able to organize people to testify. I think it'd be probably helpful to get as many people who can provide audio, visual, and video testimony in advance, so that it would produce less pressure to be able to make it into that time period, into that window for testimony. Anyway, those are my questions.
Right. So in terms of the max, I mean, if you do the math, that's 30 people an hour, but that, you know, that I don't think is realistic. That's if, you know, it's all running. So maybe you could do upwards from 20 to 25 people in an hour. You know, I don't know the interest of the board members to staying as long as they want to stay and keep listening to testimony. Those who are registered should be heard from, obviously. That could go past a 4-hour hearing.
So just to be clear, I mean, are we being given the choice of having sort of the audio and visual pre-recording available to us, or having a public hearing, or is there a possibility to do both? I mean,
no, we'd be doing no,
it's
both. It's both. We would definitely we're going ahead with the idea that you could do you know, you have those options to publicly comment, and then you can then a public hearing as well. So it's everything. Yeah.
So basically people have the choice of submitting their testimony either by audio or video starting June 1st, all the way until.
No, that would actually even start sooner. That would start when the public notice came in. So,
okay.
So that, you know, we have this idea of, like, you know, once or twice a week sending links to you folks that you can sit and listen to them. I don't want to give you, you know, 4 hours of video all at once, but we'll take a look at it. We'll parse the videos, send you the link, and you can listen to those recordings, as well as, you know, obviously, I believe we already sent some written testimony that we have received through email, and we've always do that, and we would continue to do that as well.
Okay. Andrew, how will you stop? How will you ensure that whoever calls in, that it's only a 2-minute message? Will there be a cutoff?
Well, there's a certain amount of time that's allowed in the message. You know, it's over 2 minutes. I think it's about 2 minutes and 30 seconds or something like that in the voicemail before it cuts off. And then the videos, obviously people could submit a very long video, but I think most people would hopefully, we would respectfully request that it's 2 minutes when they submit a video. And hopefully they would keep to that. I imagine there would be some people who would go beyond that, but you know, hopefully that they would be respectful of that when they're submitting a video.
Is there a clock in Zoom or anything that we'll be using for when we have the hearing via Zoom?
Yeah, we've done different, I know that, and we have to figure out, there's different ways you can do it, but you know, when we're watching the city council members have 2 minutes to speak. So there was a clock that ran down. That would be a visual. And I think we would probably just have a screenshot of that, along with, you know, how, you know, the people that were coming up and things like that. So that would be something that would sort of be on the screen.
So thank you for, and the staff for coming up with these ideas. We are meeting with a lot of very anxious tenants who I think some of them, as you heard earlier, are very anxious about having their say and not being able to have it the same way this year. So with that being said, I'm wondering if, because we normally have at least 4 hearings per borough, I'm wondering if we can commit to 2 days as opposed to just 1. That's my first question.
Let me just respond to that. I think because we've lost a month of our calendar, and the law requires us to have 1 hearing, I think we've been going based on that assumption. I guess it's an open question. I would just state my personal preference, which is I think 1 day of hearings, given our reduced schedule, that we've lost that whole month of time, I think that's appropriate. I think that having the recorded opportunities to testify allows for kind of a broader kind of participation that we haven't had in the past. And so I think kind of balancing the shortened schedule and then the increased access through the pre-recorded, I think it's a good compromise.
Yeah, I want to point out that this year people are anxious, tenants and, dare I say, landlords alike. I'm passionate, Shayla's passionate, Patty's passionate, Scott's passionate as always, but even more so this year. And our respective constituencies and bases are even more passionate and have a lot to say. So I think that it's fairly likely that there are going to be a lot more people that can fill in 1 day. And because of that, I'm just a little bit cautious about making people feel a little bit more disenfranchised than might have been intended. And we all as board members understand like the limitations and what we've been working with and that we've been working the best. But I think the public just sees it as, first of all, I can't believe they're moving forward. And second of all, now, I'm not even going to get to have like a say. So those are the reasons why I bring up that maybe a second day, and it could even be a half day. It doesn't need to be, but I think just providing it, and if no one comes to testify, no one signs up, it's fine. But I don't think it hurts to just offer it as an option, sort of like maybe as a backup.
I just had a sort of a question and then a comment on Leah's point about the backup. So typically in other years, there was a meeting in each borough. Is that how there would be 4?
4.
Okay.
Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, Manhattan.
Yeah, didn't think it happened.
Yeah, and I
there's not as many rental units, and I don't want to speak for Staten Island.
Yeah, no.
But
we've been asked this before, but there's very few stabilized units on Staten Island, so I don't think we get much of a response there. But
so then, to Leah's point, are you talking about saying like 2 already announced dates where there's meetings, or is it like we have 1, but if the response is so much, then we schedule a second?
No, I was saying we definitely have 2.
Mm-hmm.
The first one we know is definitely going to be full. And the second one, there may be a paltry response or it may be full, but I think just in case offering it as a backup, because, and I think maybe even Patty and Scott might be hearing this, but we're just hearing a lot of people are anxious and they want their due. They want their words heard. And whatever the decision the board makes, I can tell you, people may be happy, people are going to be unhappy. And so I think just giving people the most opportunity to speak and be heard in this year is most important. And I'll quickly point out, I know it might sound contrite, but I just also want to say people are, even though some people are not like at work, some people may be working remotely, some people aren't employed, people are still sort of like processing this. And it sounds so easy to sort of just like pick up a phone or call or whatever, but it's not, just because, you know, people are still thinking about how to get supplies and so forth. So this, even though it sounds like a very small thing to do, like go register for the Rent Guidelines Board hearing and go testify for 2 minutes. I just want to say, I think for a lot of people, it's not. I personally know a lot of people who have died, and then people who I know people who have died, and people are sort of just processing a lot. So I think just giving the most opportunity, it would be good.
Can I piggyback on that? I think that I've lost, I mean, and I don't know if this is just me making sure that we are as open and flexible to make sure we get as many testimonies, but in 4 hearings, how many tenants total we have testify? Close to 300. And so if we do 60 in a day, is that really creating space for us to hear from tenants in a way that like feels real and genuine? I think that those are the distinctions I think is important for me. Like we, for example, tend to have in some hearings, something like 10 to 15 people sign up ahead of the hearing. And most people come in and actually sign up when they get to the hearing. And so that option is taken out. And now we have one day with 60 potential speakers if we stick to the 2-minute rule and everything goes smoothly with no breaks whatsoever. That just doesn't feel comparable to me. And I am assuming that I haven't gotten a single text from tenants being like, don't oppose not having only one hearing. And so I just want to make sure it's heard. And I will say that I'm completely opposed to having only one hearing where people can testify. That just
I think Alex is trying, I'm sorry, Shayla. I think Alex is trying to get in on the conversation too.
Oh, you're muted, Alex.
So
Alex,
I agree with a lot of this. I think that if there's a large outpouring of requests, it's really hard to have it in one session. And also given you have at least 3 different constituencies, you know, elected officials, landlords, and tenants. And let's say you have a maximum of 100 people, assuming some of them will be no-shows. And let's say that fills up within a couple days. You will know pretty quickly if you need to have an additional session, or you'd have to be ultra marathon session, which is probably not a great idea. The other thing I'm wondering is if we should have at least a minimum number of slots for each category to be sure that there is representation. So, you know, some number of elected officials, some number of tenants, some number of landlords, to be sure that if we have one session, there's representation. But again, if there's a huge number of people, we fill up the 100 slots right away, I think it probably makes the case for another session. And as you know, as Leah said, if there isn't, we don't need to have it, or it doesn't have to be that long. But if we have a huge demand, I don't know if there will be, I think it's hard to say it can only be one session.
Andrew, let me ask just a clarifying legal question before you get to Alex's questions. Do we need to specify the day and time 30 days in advance, or do we just need to kind of notice this and then we have some flexibility to kind of design it?
I believe, and I may have to ask on this. Leah, what are you smiling at?
I thank you for all of your work, Andrew.
At the time of the public notice of hearing, we have to have the dates that we are providing hearings.
And the times?
And the times. And I think that we need to, so if we are going to add another hearing, that we would need to know that before the public notice. Otherwise, it's another, you would have to put another public notice to comment, I believe, which then, in a 30-day public comment period, I believe, I could go back and check that's my understanding. I don't want to say that's definite, but I'd have to go back and see if we could add hearings after having it. The one thing that we do, though, is if we're putting out a date for the final vote, we do need 72 hours. This I do know. If we decide after the hearing we want another hearing, then we need 72 hours of public notice of that hearing. Like any public meeting of the board. And then we can hold it. So say we have a hearing on the 10th, and then we decide that we want another one, you have to have that public, and that's published in the city record. So it's more like you need, 5 days before you can have another public hearing. Most likely.
I guess part of what, and Alex, I'm sorry that I kind of cut off Andrew from answering your questions, but I'm guessing that we're probably going to need to decide what we're going to do very far in advance, which is just going to impact people's decisions, I think.
I think that I think you have to decide, yes, before the public notice.
Yeah,
So
I
that's-
thought it
Alex,
was
you're
also
muted.
the date of the final vote too. Like it needed to be a certain number of days before the
It's
final
72
vote.
hours, yes. So, but that's changing a date,
Yeah, yeah.
we have a July 1st date that we're supposed to meet. Obviously, I don't even know, for the new members, by law, we're supposed to file with the city clerk our decision by July 1 of every year. So we have that's always sitting out there. And then I think it's important that, we do have 72 hours before notice of a final vote, but we don't ever really want to do that. We want to give people opportunity to know when a hearing, and especially our final vote or a public hearing is going to be, so they have plenty of time to participate. That's the whole point of CAPA, where there's 30 days from the time the meeting notice is put in the city record to the 30 days of people to respond to the notice, and then public hearings. So that's why it's part of CAPA, so people aren't taken, all of a sudden there's public hearings announced, and 3 days later there they are. That we try to avoid doing meetings like that if we can. I mean, I know it's a strange year, but if we know going in that we're gonna want an extra hearing, I think it's something that we have to do. Look, we can doesn't preclude us from canceling meetings as well. I mean, we reserve that right. So if we have 2 people show up at our public hearing, and we don't feel like they're I think we could probably end up canceling a public hearing, although I'm not even sure of that, because that's a public hearing. These are legal questions that I haven't had to think about before, considering, because the idea of ever canceling a public hearing was never an option. So I'd have to go back and see if public hearings are treated differently than public meetings. I mean, we always reserve the right to cancel a public meeting if we have to. Public hearing there may be a little bit, that may not be the same process to do.
I'm sorry, let me just get back to Alex, because I feel I cut him off.
You're muted.
Alex, we don't hear you.
Sorry, are you talking?
This might be silly, but I'm just wondering if there's a way of, instead of treating them as 2 separate public hearings, treating them as one. So in other words, you don't really end the first one, you just continue on the next day. If there's a need for it. If we don't, we can terminate it. It's a parliamentary or legal question, but since it's not a physical presence, I'm just wondering if you can just sort of pause it and then resume the next day if there was a need for that. And that way you wouldn't have to worry about scheduling a second meeting in advance.
Alex, we're going to make you filibuster overnight.
Anyway, but the other question is
right. If there's a cutoff, I mean, in reality, there was a limit to, when we go to a place and hire, a place to go and do a public hearing, a building closes at some point. You're right. Like if it's sort of the same idea that you continue the hearing at some other point, or like a baseball game that I think you have to, if it goes past 2, you can only go to 2 a.m. in the morning, and then afterwards you got to pick it up or something.
Maybe Alex, maybe Andrew and I should talk to the law department about some of these technical questions.
Yeah, I think the straight and easy thing is to have the hearing. We know we're going to have it, and put that in as public notice. I think that's, regardless of what the law department says we can do, that's probably what they would most encourage us to do.
Yeah,
David? Yeah,
I think I second that because, we've just been getting a lot of questions from elected officials about whether they can testify and when the date is, because their schedules are very demanding as well. And a lot of them want to know like the specific day so that they can put it, like in their schedule. And I know a lot of our tenants also would like to know like the specific day so that they can schedule it. And I just wanted to quickly ask if it's possible. I know we're having Spanish translation. I don't know if we can have Mandarin as well. But if it is possible, that's probably our second largest language. So
I believe what we've had about 3 or 4 Mandarin speakers a year. And we've worked with the group. They generally come to the Manhattan hearing. It was in Lower Manhattan, but last year they came to Brooklyn, I believe, because it was the closest hearing. I think we would certainly, if they request that, yes, absolutely. And we would probably treat like that testimony as, I don't think we'd have simultaneous Mandarin for the entire time because they generally just come and leave. So I'd have to deal with that, but certainly we would allow for translation if it's requested, no question about it. Yeah. So we could accommodate that. I think the large majority of those who are non-speaking English speakers are going to be Spanish, so we want to provide the simultaneous, which I think will also increase the number of speakers that we can hear. I think that in a certain amount of time. I don't know if it's still enough time, but some of the things that have part of giving people, when you have 4 hearings, it's a lot easier to do this, but when you just have the translator, they speak and then your 2 minutes goes to 4 minutes. Here, we won't have that issue. So, we will save some time there. I can't quantify that completely, but.
So Andrew, when do we have to have a final decision on this issue?
Well, our votes, the timeline that, we need to know tomorrow, basically, I think, if you want our timeline to remain the same, David. I don't.
Yeah. So we have to resolve this quickly. As a group, we have to resolve this quickly. I'm just trying to think.
If that's okay, in terms of everything that we're talking about here. So would it be possible to have 2 days as is being recommended? It's I can have basically 4 hearings. So we have 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening on one day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening on that second day, and all 4 of those notices go out tomorrow. Just to have that ready, and then also provide the option of sending audio and video. That way we have all of that in advance. That way, it's like if it comes a possibility where there are 2 people who come to the hearing on any of those 2-hour blocks, we don't have to sit there for 4 hours listening to 2 people. We can sort of hedge our bets that way. So basically it'll be 4 hearings, 2 hours each on 2 separate days. And that way, it's like that sort of, makes it more predictable for us as board members to know when it's going to happen. It'll be predictable for others as well, so they know that they have a variety of options to be able to participate. And again, it's like if it happens that some of those are not filled with people wanting to speak, we're not on the hook for sitting there for an entire 4 hours or 5 hours or whatever it is. Pushback or. And it's like I'm curious to hear what people think about that.
Well, in the past, we've stayed. If we advertise a time frame, we've stayed for the time frame we advertise.
Right.
Just because someone might show up at the end of that time.
We would have to be there through the time. Absolutely, Shayla. We'd have to be.
Yeah, and then I think the second part to that is that I think that works in the context of giving more opportunities and different times so that folks, who have small children, like many of you all do, can, stay in the day doing that work and then maybe go and testify later in the evening. And so it allows for that flexibility. I think the challenge is, and I think to Andrew's point, if people are registering, how do you know what day you fall into? Are you registering for a specific day? And then what happens to most of the people who attend the hearings who don't register ahead of time. Like, what is our remedy for that? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that sounds like a reasonable thing to think through, the 2 days into different time periods. I think it also brings up challenges, the same challenges that existed in the other scenario for me.
Sure. I mean, it's like in terms of the decision that we have to take today or tomorrow, it would be sort of when the times are. And then, of course, I mean, it's like we have to figure out what makes sense in order to make sure that people have a slot. I mean, it's like, you know, whether it's some link that says sign up for one of the dates and you're given a number or whatever that is.
Yeah, if there were scenarios like that where essentially four hearings in 2 days, you would be signing up for that time period that you want to speak. That's how it would work. So either by calling our office, excuse me, I want to speak on June 10th at the evening hearing from 7 to 9. I don't know what the date would be. That's what they'd be signing up for. Or if they email us or they do that online, the option would be which day that you want to sign up. People would be, yeah, I mean.
I think my own personal preference, I think we need more than one hearing. I think that's clear to me. I think I personally would prefer 2 at longer time frames. So just to give, you know, maybe it's the morning into the afternoon for one day, and then the other one's the afternoon into the evening. But just so that, because I think just hearing from a lot of people at once is, in one sense, easier to process the information, because for me, it's easier to hear sort of the, if there are common themes that come out instead of breaking it up into so many segments. And then just also, I think we should notice those 2 times in advance. It's because, you know, people still do have schedules they're trying to keep or do things. And so that when they register, they're registering for one specific date versus the other.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing from people, I mean, it's just that people want more and they would prefer, you know, 2 days to 1 day. That seems to be the common themes. Maybe Andrew and I should kind of check in with the law department about some of these details, and then I should report back to people tomorrow and tell you what I hear. But that's what I'm hearing people say. Am I getting it correctly? All right, so then I'll do that. I'll Andrew and I will do a little bit more legwork, and then I'll report back to people.
So yeah, so the idea is to have 2 public hearings. Okay.
Okay. All right. So this is our marathon day. Every year, this is our marathon day. I'm ready to adjourn, but I guess before I ask for a motion to adjourn, does anyone want to stay on this call a little bit longer and raise any new subjects?
Not a new subject, but I just going back to the calendar question, because so we have Thursday the 7th, and then right now what I have on my calendar is the 16th and the 25th of June. Is that the tentative schedule? Although it doesn't matter now because we might be changing it.
You know, Andrew and I may come back with some suggested revisions, and I would just say let's hold off on finalizing the dates yet. So not today, but I'll try to get the dates set in stone with Andrew as soon as we can.
Yeah, we certainly would know before Thursday what we're doing in terms of dates. Last week it was said about our staff what the job and effort they were doing, and we all very much appreciate that. But I would be somewhat neglected if I didn't mention that our chair David has put so many hours into this. I've worked with a lot of executive directors before, and none have had to face this challenge. But at every point, he has faced the challenge and tackled it head on, and has been available to staff and to me. And David, I'm very appreciative, and I think that should be recognized before we depart for the day.
Okay. Thank you. That's a nice note for me to end the day on. So
thank you.
All right.
Can I say something about?
I'll talk to you guys tomorrow, and I'll see you all on Thursday.
Wait, David, first of all, you're forgetting
The most important
Shayla,
thing.
but you forgot about the motion, but
Oh, wait,
take
Shayla,
all that back.
sorry,
I
there's
don't think
anything
any
else?
of it. David doesn't know what the hell he's doing.
I wanted to just ask a few questions about, in the past, we've had HPD testify and they're not testifying this year. We've had DHCR testify and they're not testifying this year. Are we creating space to actually either have that data presented to us, have a conversation about the data? I think it's important, since we've been having this conversation on looking back, COVID times. I think that all those pieces help us make a decision that feels more holistic. Where are we on that? And what are the
Shayla, I mean, those are totally good points. Let Andrew and there's just getting commitments from getting things committed has been difficult because of the crisis. So again, give me and Andrew, I mean, do you think by tomorrow, Andrew, we could have a little bit further certainty on some of these things, or is that overly optimistic?
So, yeah, I would hope so.
We're going to try, Shayla. I'm going to try to get some more specifics on that.
All right.
And Andrew, I would make a formal request to use my questions from last year that tend to not get answered to ask again, to hopefully get some answers to those questions that I've been asking for about 5 years.
During this meeting, I sent around those questions, and you will see those questions again, Shayla, in the questions. We have 60 some odd questions that we asked. Occasionally, I'll delete a few if they become outdated or that they were answered in previous. Some are not, asking for data year over year. It's asking for one thing. But I think maybe I did that once this year. I also added a few questions to see what's happened after June of last year and some of the data that I requested. There's not much that they can tell us after June, to be honest. There's a few areas they can. But if you see other additional questions in there, May 12th was the date that so a week from today, if you could get those to me, that'd be great. But they are working. They say they are working on the questions. I actually got a follow-up call about one of them the other day. So.
Any other questions or comments?
And I know I say this every year, but I cannot say it enough, it feels like, because I even tell Woody every time I see him outside of these hearings, that I cannot say how important it is to have the state agency that administer our decision come and testify, and not only testify, but also answer questions that we have ongoing. I think this year is even more important because they have real, like right now, information that they can provide for us in a different context, and also can shed some light on where their thoughts either on record or maybe they won't speak on it. But at least we could ask questions, the questions that have come up around, what happened after June, because when we've, I've been engaging with them for the whole time after June to get clarity on how and what they interpret these things to be. And so I would, again, say how important it is for them to testify. I would encourage both city, state officials to make sure it happens, since it really does impact our decision as a board.
Agreed. Okay, so I will check in with everyone tomorrow and enjoy the rest of your day.
No,
I'm sorry, motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Yes, seconded.
Thanks. Okay, now enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.